Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the distance between an idea and the horizon is sometimes measured in rope and wood and the willingness to trust the sea. Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing on a wooden raft, not a modern vessel with instruments and engines and emergency beacons, but something older and simpler. 9 logs of balsa wood, lashed together with hemp rope, sitting low in the water, with a bamboo deck and a single square sail catching whatever wind the Pacific decides to offer. There is no motor, no radar, no way to call for help if something goes wrong. Around you in every direction, nothing but open ocean, thousands of miles of it, under a sky so wide it almost feels like a kind of pressure. The raft moves slowly, almost gently, carried west by a current that does not care about your plans. And somewhere ahead, invisible beyond the curve of the earth, are islands that most people in 1947 believed no ancient civilization could ever have reached from where you're standing. This is not a story about a sailor. That is one of the first things worth understanding. The man who built this raft and climbed onto it and sailed it across the Pacific Ocean was not a sailor at all. He was an anthropologist and a naturalist, a man who had spent his life studying animals and cultures and the way ancient peoples moved across the world. He had no formal training in navigation, no real experience at sea, and by most reasonable assessments, no business being out there at all. And yet, his name was Thor Heyerdahl. He was born on October 6, 1914, in Lervik, a small coastal town in Norway, which is perhaps fitting. Norway being a country with a long relationship with the sea, even if Heyerdahl himself had not yet developed one. His father ran a brewery. His mother was deeply interested in natural history and evolution, and she passed that curiosity on to her son early. As a boy, Heyerdahl collected insects and small animals, kept a kind of personal natural history museum in his childhood home, and read everything he could find about the natural world. He was not a boy who dreamed of sailing. He was a boy who dreamed of understanding. Those two things would eventually collide in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but that came later. He studied zoology and geography at the University of Oslo in the 1930s, and it was there that his interest began to stretch beyond the local and the familiar. He became fascinated by the question of how species and peoples moved across the planet, how things that existed on one side of an ocean sometimes appeared on the other side, and what that meant about the connections between ancient civilizations. These were not small questions, and they were not easy ones. But Heyerdahl was the kind of person who did not find difficulty discouraging. He found it interesting. In 1937, he made a decision that would change the entire direction of his life. He and his first wife, Liv Coucheron-Torp, travelled to the Marquesas Islands in the South Pacific to live for a year in as close to a natural pre-modern state as they could manage. The original plan had something to do with studying the local fauna, the animals and plants of the islands, but what Heyerdahl found there went far beyond anything he had expected to study. The Marquesas are a remote archipelago in French Polynesia, about 850 miles northeast of Tahiti. They're green and dramatic, with steep volcanic ridges and valleys that open toward the sea. The people who lived there had their own history, their own traditions, their own understanding of where they came from. And it was that understanding, or rather the gap between that understanding and what Western academics believed, that began to take hold of Heyerdahl's imagination in a way he could not shake loose. He and Liv settled on the island of Fatu Hiva, the southernmost of the Marquesas, living in a valley with minimal contact with the outside world. It was not easy. There were insects, illness, isolation, and the slow, grinding difficulty of daily life without modern conveniences. But Heyerdahl was paying attention. He was watching the ocean. He was listening to the people around him, and he was beginning to notice things that did not quite fit the accepted story. The accepted story at the time was fairly straightforward. Polynesia had been populated by peoples who migrated eastward from Southeast Asia, island hopping across the Pacific over thousands of years. This was the dominant view among anthropologists and archaeologists, and it had significant evidence behind it. But Heyerdahl, sitting on Fatuhiva, watching the wind and the current move steadily from east to west, began to wonder if the story might be more complicated than that. Because here was the thing. The wind came from the east. The current came from the east. If you set a raft in the water off the coast of South America and let go, the natural movement of the Pacific would carry you westward, toward Polynesia. That was simply true. It was not a theory. It was physics. And if that was true, then the ocean was not necessarily the barrier that everyone assumed it was. It was potentially a road. Heyerdahl began reading and thinking about this more carefully. He encountered local Marquesan legends about a great figure called Tiki, sometimes Kon-Tiki, who was said to be a sun king, a leader, a man who had come from the east, from a land across the water, and brought his people with him to the islands. The name Tiki appeared across Polynesian cultures in various forms, always associated with origins, always connected to something that came before. Heyerdahl found this striking. He also found something else striking, something botanical, something very specific, that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire debate that followed. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, a plant that is native to South America. Not to Asia, not to the Pacific Islands, but to South America, specifically to the Andean region, where it had been cultivated for thousands of years. And yet, when European explorers arrived in Polynesia, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, in the Cook Islands, in Easter Island, they found sweet potatoes already growing there. The plant was already part of the local diet, already embedded in local agricultural traditions, long before any European ship could have carried it across the ocean. How did it get there? Polynesia and South America are separated by thousands of miles of open Pacific. The sweet potato does not float, it does not travel on its own. Something, or someone, had to carry it. This was not a small detail. This was a genuine puzzle, and Heyerdahl seized on it. Combined with the wind patterns, the ocean currents, the legends of Tiki, and what he was beginning to see as other cultural and botanical similarities between Polynesia and South America, he began to form a theory, a controversial one. He believed that at some point in the ancient past, people from South America, possibly from the Andean civilizations, possibly related to the pre-Inca cultures of Peru, had sailed westward across the Pacific on rafts and reached Polynesia, and that they were among the ancestors of the people living there today. This was not, to put it gently, what the academic establishment wanted to hear. When Heyerdahl returned from the Marquesas in 1938 and began developing his ideas, and then when he tried to publish them in the early 1940s, he ran into a wall. Journals rejected his papers. Experts dismissed his reasoning. The mainstream view was that the linguistic evidence, the archaeological evidence, the cultural evidence all pointed to Southeast Asia as the origin of the Polynesian peoples, not South America. Heyerdahl was told, in various ways and with varying degrees of politeness, that he was wrong. He did not accept that. But he also began to understand something important about the nature of the argument he was making. He could write papers and cite evidence and debate with academics all he wanted, and it might not change anything. What he could not do, what no one had done, was demonstrate that the journey itself was actually possible, that a vessel using only ancient materials and ancient technology could actually travel from South America to Polynesia. If no one had ever shown that, then the entire debate rested on an assumption that had never been tested, so he decided to test it. Before we go further into what that decision meant and what it took to actually make it happen, I want to pause here for just a moment and ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere warm, with a window cracked open and the sound of the night outside, or somewhere cold, with a blanket pulled up and the house quiet around you? And have you ever had an idea, something you believed was true, something you could feel was right, that the people around you simply would not accept? Because that is really where this story starts. Not on the ocean. In a quiet room somewhere with a man and a conviction, and no good way to prove it except to go and do the impossible thing himself. If you are enjoying this kind of storytelling, slow, detailed, the kind of thing you can listen to late at night without it feeling rushed or loud, it would mean a great deal if you hit the like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, please consider doing that. It helps the channel more than you might think, and it means more stories like this one can find their way to people who enjoy them. Thank you. Genuinely. Now. Thor Heyerdahl, in the mid-1940s, was a man with a theory and no proof. He had been to the Marquesas, he had seen the wind and the current, he had read the legends, he had noticed the sweet potato, and he had come home to Norway and been told he was wrong. The Second World War had interrupted everything. Heyerdahl served with the Free Norwegian Forces during the war, which is its own remarkable story. But when the war ended, he came back to his theory with the same conviction he had left it with, maybe more. What he needed to do was build a raft and sail it across the Pacific. Simple as that, and also completely terrifying. The man who would attempt this was 32 years old. He had no sailing experience worth mentioning. He had studied animals and cultures and ancient migration patterns. He had lived on a remote island in the South Pacific and served in a war. He was, by most accounts, quietly charismatic, deeply stubborn, and genuinely passionate about ideas in a way that made people want to follow him, even when the idea in question was to cross the largest ocean on Earth on a wooden raft with no engine. He was also, it is worth saying, physically capable and genuinely brave. Not reckless. Heyerdahl was actually quite careful in his planning and preparation, far more careful than the casual image of a wild adventurer might suggest. But brave in the specific way that some people are brave, where the fear is present and acknowledged and simply not allowed to be the deciding factor. He would say later that he was frightened during the voyage. He said it openly, without embarrassment. He just went anyway. That combination, careful preparation, genuine fear, and the refusal to let the fear win, is maybe the most human thing about Thor Heyerdahl. He was not a superhero. He was not reckless. He was a man who believed something and decided to prove it in the most direct way he could imagine. And the most direct way he could imagine was to lash 9 balsa logs together, load them with supplies, and let the Pacific carry him west. The question of whether the journey was possible had never been answered. Heyerdahl intended to answer it, and the answer would take 101 days, 4,300 miles of open ocean, 6 men, a parrot, several very large sharks, and one extremely violent encounter with a coral reef. But before any of that could happen, there was the matter of actually building the thing. And that, as it turned out, would require a trip to Peru, a study of Spanish colonial records, a forest in Ecuador, and a conversation with naval engineers who were quite confident the whole enterprise was going to sink. So let us go back a little further, back to where the idea actually began to take shape. Not as an abstract theory, not as an academic paper waiting to be written, but as something Heyerdahl had felt in his body, standing on a beach in the Marquesas Islands with the wind at his back. The year was 1937. Heyerdahl was 22 years old, newly married to a woman named Liv Coucheron-Torp, and the two of them had made a decision that most people in their lives probably found baffling. They were going to leave Norway, travel to the South Pacific and live on a remote island as close to a pre-industrial existence as they could manage. Not as tourists, not for a few weeks. They wanted to stay for a year, maybe longer, and try to understand what life on a Polynesian island would have looked like before the modern world arrived. It was a romantic idea in every sense of the word. Idealistic, a little naive, genuinely adventurous, and driven by a kind of intellectual curiosity that Heyerdahl had carried since childhood. The island they chose was Fatu Hiva, the southernmost and most remote of the Marquesas Islands, which lie in French Polynesia roughly in the middle of the South Pacific. Fatu Hiva in the late 1930s was not entirely untouched by the modern world, but it was about as close as you could get. The island is steep and dramatic, covered in dense vegetation, with narrow valleys that drop sharply to the sea. It rains a great deal. The population was small. The couple built a shelter, tried to grow food, learned what they could from the islanders, and largely struggled. They got sick, they had supply problems, and the romantic vision of paradise proved considerably harder than the idea of it. They eventually had to leave after about a year, earlier than they had planned. But something happened to Heyerdahl on that island that had nothing to do with the difficulty of living there. He started paying attention to the ocean in a specific way. He noticed, as anyone living on the western coast of an island will notice, that the wind came from the east. Consistently, persistently, the trade winds blew from east to west, and the current in the water moved the same way. If you put something in the water off the eastern shore of Thor Heyerdahl, it would drift west, not east, not north, not south, west. This was not a discovery. Oceanographers and navigators had known about the trade winds in the South Equatorial Current for centuries. But Heyerdahl was not an oceanographer. He was a young naturalist living on a beach, and he felt it in a very physical, immediate way. The ocean here did not separate South America from Polynesia. It connected them. It was a road, not a wall, and the road ran from east to west. At the same time, he was hearing stories. The islanders on Thor Heyerdahl and the surrounding Marquesas had oral traditions, legends and histories passed down through generations, and one figure kept appearing in them, a figure called Tiki. In Polynesian tradition, Tiki is often described as a kind of ancestral being, a founding figure, sometimes described as the first man, or a god-king who came to the islands from a distant land. The specific detail that caught Heyerdahl's attention was the direction. In some of the traditions he encountered, Tiki was said to have come from the east, from across the ocean, from a land toward the rising sun. Now, it is important to be careful here. Oral traditions are complex things. They change over time, they carry layers of meaning, and they do not always function as literal historical records. Heyerdahl was drawing a very large conclusion from stories that other scholars interpreted very differently. He knew this. But the legend of Tiki sat alongside everything else he was noticing. The wind, the current, the direction of things, and it began to form a picture in his mind. Then there was the sweet potato. This is the piece of the puzzle that is hardest to explain away, and it is worth spending a moment on it because it genuinely is one of the more remarkable botanical mysteries in the history of human migration. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, is a plant native to South America. Its origins are in the region between Peru and Ecuador, where it was cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European contact. That is well established. What is also well established is that when European explorers arrived in Polynesia in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, they found sweet potatoes already there. Not just in one place, in many places. The Cook Islands, Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island. The sweet potato was a food crop across Polynesia, and it had been there long before any European ship arrived to bring it. How did it get there? A sweet potato does not swim. It does not float reliably across thousands of miles of open ocean on its own. Someone carried it. The question is who and which direction they were travelling. The simplest explanation, the one that Heyerdahl found compelling and that still has not been fully dismissed, is that someone made a voyage from South America to Polynesia and brought the plant with them. Or, alternatively, that Polynesian voyagers reached South America and brought the sweet potato back. Either way, contact happened. The plant is evidence of a human journey across the Pacific that occurred before Columbus, before Magellan, before any European had any idea the Pacific existed. Heyerdahl, standing on Thor Heyerdahl with the trade winds at his back, looked at the sweet potato and thought, east to west. Someone came from South America, and the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the conventional story that all of Polynesia was settled by peoples migrating eastward from Southeast Asia was incomplete at best and possibly wrong. He was not the first person to notice these things. The sweet potato question had puzzled botanists for decades. The Tiki legends had been noted by earlier researchers, but Heyerdahl was the first person to pull these threads together into a sustained argument that South Americans, specifically the ancient people of Peru, had sailed west across the Pacific and played a role in the settlement of Polynesia. He even had a candidate for the figure of Tiki, a sun-worshipping culture hero from Inca tradition named Kon-Tiki, also known as Viracocha, who according to legend had led his people to the sea and sailed westward after being defeated in battle. The name, the direction, the timing. Heyerdahl found it all too coherent to be coincidence. When he and Liv returned from Fatu Hiva in 1938, he began working on his theory in earnest. He spent years in libraries and archives, reading everything he could find about Inca civilization, Polynesian culture, Pacific botany, ocean currents, and pre-Columbian history. He wrote up his argument carefully and began trying to get it in front of the people who would need to take it seriously. Anthropologists, archaeologists, ethnologists, the academic community that controlled what was accepted as knowledge about the ancient Pacific. The response was not encouraging. He submitted papers. They were rejected. He wrote to scholars. Some did not reply. Others replied to tell him, politely or less politely, that he was mistaken. The linguistic evidence was the wall he kept running into. Polynesian languages are part of the Austronesian language family, a vast group of related languages that stretches from Taiwan through the Philippines, Indonesia, and across the Pacific. The connections are clear and well documented. Polynesian languages are related to languages spoken in Southeast Asia, not to any language spoken in South America. This was, and remains, a very strong argument. Language is one of the most durable things a people carries with them, and the linguistic trail points unmistakably toward Asia, not toward Peru. Heyerdahl was aware of this argument. He did not have a completely satisfying answer to it. He acknowledged the linguistic evidence, but argued that it did not rule out an earlier pre-linguistic layer of settlement from South America, that perhaps the South American voyagers arrived first, and were later absorbed or replaced by the Austronesian-speaking peoples who came from Asia. It was a complicated position, and it satisfied almost no one in the academic world. By the mid-1940s, after the war, Heyerdahl had reached a kind of impasse. He had the theory. He had the evidence he found compelling. He had the academic rejection. And he had begun to understand with growing clarity that the argument was stuck in a way that words alone could not unstick. The debate kept returning to the same point. No one had ever actually shown that a pre-Columbian vessel could make the voyage from South America to Polynesia. It was assumed to be impossible, or at least impractical, because the ancient peoples of South America were not known as blue water sailors. They did not have the outrigger canoes of the Polynesians. They had balsa wood rafts, and balsa wood rafts, the conventional wisdom held, were coastal vessels, useful for fishing and trading along the shore, but not capable of surviving thousands of miles of open ocean. Heyerdahl thought that assumption had never actually been tested, and if it had never been tested, it could not really be called evidence. It was just a guess, an educated guess perhaps, but a guess. And he was a man who by this point in his life had developed a particular impatience with guesses that were treated as facts. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic in the way that decisions in stories are sometimes described. It was not a single moment of inspiration or a sudden clarity. It was more like the slow arrival of an obvious conclusion. If no one had tested whether the voyage was possible, then the voyage needed to be tested. And if no one else was going to do it, then Heyerdahl was going to do it himself. He would build a balsa wood raft using only the materials and techniques available to the ancient peoples of South America, and he would sail it from Peru to Polynesia. Not to prove that ancient South Americans had made the journey. He could not prove that, but to prove that they could have. That the ocean was not the barrier everyone assumed it was. That the argument at the very least deserved to be taken seriously. It was a remarkable decision for a man who, it must be said again, had essentially no sailing experience. He had lived on a Pacific island. He had served in the Norwegian military during the war, which had given him some practical skills and a fairly high tolerance for difficult conditions. But he was not a sailor. He had not spent his life on boats. He was an anthropologist and a naturalist who had decided to cross the largest ocean on Earth on a homemade raft to settle an academic argument. He went to Peru. In 1946, Heyerdahl travelled to Lima to begin his research in earnest. He needed to understand how the ancient Peruvian balsa rafts were actually built, not from guesswork, but from historical documentation. He found it in the Spanish colonial records. When Francisco Pizarro's expedition was making its way down the Pacific coast of South America in 1526, his men encountered something unexpected off the coast of Ecuador. Large balsa wood rafts being used by the indigenous people for trade. The Spanish accounts describe these vessels with some detail. They were substantial, capable of carrying significant cargo and many people, with sails and sophisticated steering systems. These were not primitive canoes. They were real ocean-going vessels, at least by the standards of coastal and inter-island trade. Heyerdahl read these accounts carefully and became more convinced than ever that the dismissal of balsa rafts as incapable of ocean voyaging was based on assumption rather than evidence. He began to plan the construction of a raft that would replicate, as closely as possible, what the ancient Peruvians would have built. And as he planned, he began to gather around him the small group of men who would, against most reasonable expectations, agree to come with him. The crew he assembled was an interesting mix. Herman Vatzinger was a Norwegian engineer with technical expertise who had met Heyerdahl in New York. Knut Haugland and Torstein Raby were both veterans of the Second World War. Specifically, both had been involved in the Norwegian resistance and in some of the more dangerous covert operations of the war, including the famous sabotage of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant. They were experienced with radio equipment and, perhaps more relevantly, with operating under difficult and dangerous conditions without panicking. Eric Hesselberg was an old friend of Heyerdahl's, a skilled navigator and artist who would be responsible for plotting their course across the Pacific. And Bengt Danielsson was a Swedish sociologist who spoke Spanish and had an academic interest in Polynesian culture. He was also, reportedly, the most calm and unflappable member of the group, which would prove useful. 6 men, none of them professional sailors, all of them, for their own reasons, willing to get on a wooden raft and see what the Pacific had to say. The raft still needed to be built, and that process, the cutting of the logs, the lashing of the ropes, the raising of the mast, would happen in the harbour at Callao, Peru, watched by sceptical naval engineers who had already begun calculating how long it would take the whole thing to sink. The balsa wood was waiting in Ecuador, in the forests near the town of Quevedo, and it would need to be cut and transported and assembled into something that could hold together for months on the open ocean. The question of whether it actually could was one that would not be answered in any harbour or any library. It would be answered, if it was answered at all, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, far from any shore. The forests near Quevedo, in the coastal lowlands of Ecuador, are not particularly dramatic to look at. They are not the dense, cathedral dark rainforest that most people picture when they think of South America. They are lower, more open, with a quality of light that comes through the canopy in broad, soft columns, and it was here, in late 1946, that the balsa trees were selected and cut for the raft that would eventually become Kon-Tiki. Heyerdahl had insisted on this, that the wood come from Ecuador, from living trees, not from dried timber sitting in a warehouse somewhere. The reason was practical. Balsa wood that has been cut and dried becomes lighter, but it also becomes more brittle and begins to lose some of the natural properties that make it useful on the water. Fresh-cut balsa, still holding its moisture, is heavier initially, but far more resilient. The ancient Peruvians would have used fresh wood, so Heyerdahl would use fresh wood. It was the kind of detail that mattered to him. Not just building a raft, but building the right raft, as close to what a pre-Columbian builder would have constructed as the evidence allowed. Balsa wood is a strange material if you have never worked with it. It is technically a hardwood. It comes from a flowering tree, Acroma pyramidale, which grows quickly in the tropical lowlands of South America. But in density it behaves more like a very firm foam. You can press your thumbnail into it and leave a mark. It is so light that a piece the size of a shoebox weighs almost nothing, and it floats with remarkable stubbornness. It does not just sit at the waterline the way denser wood does, it rides high, almost aggressively buoyant. The concern that critics raised was not about its buoyancy at the start of a voyage, but about what would happen over time. Balsa is porous, it absorbs water, and the worry was that after weeks at sea the logs would become saturated, grow heavy, and eventually sink below the surface. Heyerdahl had looked into this as carefully as he could. He believed the absorption rate was slow enough that the raft would remain functional for the duration of the voyage. His critics believed otherwise. Neither side at this point had direct evidence. They were both, in their own way, guessing. 9 logs were selected and cut. The largest was 45 feet long, the central backbone of the raft. The others were shorter, arranged in a pattern that tapered slightly at the bow, in the traditional Inca style described in the Spanish colonial accounts. They were floated down the river to the coast, and then transported by ship to Callao, the main port of Lima, where the actual construction would take place. The naval yard at Callao was made available to the expedition, which was a practical kindness. It gave them a proper working space, access to tools, and, less helpfully, a steady audience of sceptical naval engineers who watched the construction with the politely contained concern of professionals watching amateurs do something inadvisable. The construction itself was straightforward in concept and demanding in practice. The 9 balsa logs were laid side by side and lashed together with hemp rope. No nails, no wire, no bolts, no modern fasteners of any kind. This was not a romantic choice. It was a deliberate replication of Inca construction methods. The rope was threaded through holes drilled in the logs and pulled tight in a pattern that locked the logs together while still allowing them to move slightly relative to each other. This flexibility was actually important, as the crew would later discover. A rigid structure in the open ocean fights the waves. A flexible one can move with them, distributing the energy rather than absorbing it all in one place. The ancient builders had understood this, whether or not they could have articulated it in engineering terms. Heyerdahl understood it because he had read the historical accounts carefully. The naval engineers watching from the dockside understood it too, but they were still not convinced the rope would hold. Across the logs, a deck of split bamboo was laid and lashed into place. It was not a solid surface. There were gaps between the bamboo poles, which meant that water washing over the raft would drain away rather than pooling. On top of the deck, toward the stern, a small cabin was constructed from bamboo and rattan, with a roof of banana leaves. It was roughly the size of a large garden shed, maybe 6 feet wide and 9 feet long, with walls just high enough to sit upright inside but not to stand. 6 men would sleep in and around this cabin for more than 3 months. It was not comfortable by any reasonable standard, but it was shelter, and on the open ocean, shelter matters more than comfort. At the centre of the raft, a single mast was raised. 2 mangrove wood poles lashed together in an A-frame configuration, and from it hung a square sail made of canvas. On the sail, Eric Hesselberg painted a face, the sun god Kon-Tiki, the figure from Inca legend who was said to have led a people westward from South America across the sea. The image was bold and simple, a stylized face in ochre and brown, looking forward into whatever was coming. The raft's dimensions, in total, were approximately 45 feet long and 18 feet wide. It was not a small vessel exactly, but it was not large either. Placed next to a modern ocean-going yacht, it would look almost toy-like. Placed next to the Pacific Ocean, it would look, to be honest, terrifyingly small. The crew knew this. They loaded their supplies with the knowledge that there would be no resupply, no backup delivery, no turning around if something ran out. They brought 275 cans of various foods, including military rations left over from the war, practical, calorie-dense, not particularly appetizing but reliable. They brought coconuts and sweet potatoes, partly for nutrition, and partly because both were plants that Heyerdahl believed ancient Pacific voyagers would have carried. They brought fishing equipment, a small kerosene stove, scientific instruments, and 2 radio sets. Knut Haugland and Torstein Raby had built the radio equipment themselves, and they were confident it would work. They had, after all, operated radios in far more difficult conditions during the war, transmitting from occupied Norway under circumstances where being discovered meant being shot. A wooden raft in the Pacific seemed almost relaxed by comparison. The scepticism from the naval engineers was not casual. Several of them put their concerns in writing. One assessment, from a professional engineer who had examined the raft, stated plainly that the vessel would not survive more than 2 weeks in open ocean conditions. The hemp rope, he argued, would chafe against the balsa logs as the raft flexed in the waves, and within a short time the lashings would fail. The logs, he believed, would absorb water faster than Heyerdahl expected and would lose their buoyancy. The raft, in his professional judgment, was not seaworthy. Heyerdahl read these assessments, thanked the engineers for their time, and continued preparing for departure. He was not reckless or dismissive by nature. He was, in most respects, a careful and methodical person. But he'd made his decision, and the decision rested on a different kind of evidence than the engineers were using. They were applying modern standards of naval architecture to a vessel that was not trying to meet modern standards. It was trying to meet ancient ones, and the ancient ones, as far as anyone actually knew, had never been properly tested. There was one piece of the raft that deserves particular attention, because it turned out to be more important than almost anyone had anticipated before the voyage began. Between the logs, at several points along the length of the raft, vertical wooden boards were inserted, long flat pieces of wood that could be pushed down between the logs so that they extended below the hull into the water, or pulled up and stored on deck when not needed. These were called guaras, and they were an Inca technology. When the Spanish first observed Inca balsa rafts using these boards, they did not fully understand their purpose. They recorded them as a curiosity, boards hanging in the water under the raft, without grasping what they actually did. What they did was act as a kind of adjustable keel. By raising or lowering different guaras at different points along the raft, the crew could change the way the water flowed under the hull, and in doing so, exert a degree of directional control. It was not precise. It was not like steering a boat with a rudder in the conventional sense. But it was real control, enough to make meaningful adjustments to the raft's heading, enough to navigate, enough to make choices about where the raft was going rather than simply going wherever the current decided. Heyerdahl and his crew would learn to use the guaras during the voyage itself, gradually developing a feel for how different combinations of raised and lowered boards affected their direction. It was, in its way, a beautiful piece of engineering, simple, effective, requiring no moving parts and no maintenance, just a set of wooden boards and the knowledge of how to use them. By April of 1947, the raft was as ready as it was going to be. The supplies were loaded and lashed down. The radio equipment was installed in the cabin. The sail was rigged. The crew had said their goodbyes to Lima, some of them to families, some of them to the naval officers who had helped them, some of them simply to solid ground which they would not see again for a very long time. There was a small ceremony at the dock, and there were photographs taken, and there was the particular quality of atmosphere that surrounds any departure that might go badly. A mixture of genuine excitement, forced cheerfulness, and a quiet, private acknowledgement that the thing being attempted is genuinely dangerous. The Peruvian Navy had agreed to tow Kon-Tiki out from the harbour and into open water, which was necessary because the raft had no engine and could not be manoeuvred out of the port on its own. A naval tug would take them far enough offshore that the current could catch them, and then the line would be cut, and the Pacific would be theirs to deal with. Heyerdahl stood on the deck of the raft in those final hours in the harbour and looked at what they had built. It was, by any objective measure, a modest thing. 9 logs and some rope, a bamboo deck, a small hut, a painted sail. It did not look like a vessel capable of crossing 4,000 miles of open ocean. It looked like something you might build on a long weekend if you had access to a good forest and a strong incentive. and yet the historical record suggested that the ancient peoples of South America had built exactly this kind of vessel, or something very like it, and had used it for trading and travel along the coast and possibly much further. The question was whether much further could mean the Pacific. The question was whether the ocean that had always been described as a barrier was actually, if you had the right vessel and the right currents and the right winds, something more like a road. Heyerdahl believed it was. He was about to find out if believing it was enough to survive it. The departure was set for April 28th, 1947. The morning came with the particular clarity that Lima sometimes has in the autumn. The coastal fog that the locals call the garua, not yet thick enough to close everything in, the light still present and pale over the harbour. The crew climbed aboard. The tug took the line, and the raft that had been built in a naval yard in Callao, watched by skeptics and blessed by a small crowd of well-wishers, began to move out through the harbour toward the open sea. The balsa logs sat in the water with exactly the buoyancy Heyerdahl had hoped for. The hemp ropes held. The bamboo deck was solid underfoot. For the moment, everything was working. The moment, of course, was the easy part. The easy part was the harbour, where the water was calm and the shore was still visible and the tug was still attached. The harder parts were coming, and they were coming fast, because once the naval vessel cut the line and turned back toward Callao, there would be nothing between 6 men on a wooden raft and the largest ocean on Earth. And the ocean, as it turned out, had its own opinions about what was going to happen next. The construction of Kon-Tiki had taken place over several weeks in the naval yard at Callao, and it was, by most accounts, a strange and somewhat chaotic process. Heyerdahl had arrived in Peru in late 1946 with a theory, a crew, and almost no practical experience in building anything that needed to float on open water for months at a time. What he had instead was research. Careful, detailed research into how the Inca and their predecessors had actually built their ocean-going rafts, drawn from Spanish colonial accounts, from illustrations, from the oral traditions of coastal Peruvian communities, and from his own careful reading of everything that had been written about pre-Columbian Pacific navigation. The goal was not to build a modern approximation of an ancient raft. The goal was to build something as close to the original as the available materials and knowledge would allow. That meant no nails, no wire, no synthetic rope, no steel fittings, no modern adhesives or sealants. The raft would be held together by rope and by the natural properties of the wood itself, and by nothing else. The balsa logs came from Ecuador, from a forest near the town of Quevedo in the lowland interior. Balsa, Ochroma pyramidal, grows fast and light, and the wood has a cellular structure that makes it extraordinarily buoyant. A freshly cut balsa log contains a large amount of moisture, but it is still significantly lighter than most other tropical hardwoods. The concern that engineers had raised, that the logs would become waterlogged over time and lose their buoyancy, was a real one, and it was one that Heyerdahl took seriously. He had done what research he could. The Spanish accounts suggested that Inca rafts had made long ocean voyages without sinking. He chose to trust the historical record over the warnings of the naval engineers, which was either an act of admirable conviction or a considerable gamble, depending on how you looked at it. Probably both. 9 logs were selected and cut. The largest of them was 45 feet long, and it formed the centre line of the raft, the backbone around which everything else was arranged. The remaining 8 logs were arranged in decreasing lengths on either side of this central log, so that the finished raft had a roughly pointed bow and a broader stern, tapering in a way that gave it a functional shape in the water. The logs were laid parallel to each other, touching or nearly touching along their length, and then bound together with hemp rope, thick, natural fibre rope that had been soaked and stretched and tested before use. The lashing was done at multiple points along each log, crossing and recrossing in patterns that distributed the tension evenly and prevented any single binding from bearing too much load. It was careful work, and it took time, and it required the crew to learn as they went, because none of them had lashed a balsa raft together before, and the Spanish colonial descriptions were not always as specific as you might hope. Across the top of the logs, a deck of split bamboo was laid and tied down, creating a surface that was springy and uneven but functional. Something you could walk on, something you could sit on, something that would drain water quickly when waves came over the side, which they would. At the stern, 2 long steering oars were mounted, one on each side attached to the rearmost logs with simple rope fittings. These were for gross directional control, for making large adjustments when the raft needed to be turned significantly. The finer, more nuanced steering would be done with the guaras, those vertical boards that could be raised and lowered between the logs to change the hydrodynamic profile of the hull. Near the centre of the raft, a mast was stepped, a bipod mast, 2 poles joined at the top and spread at the base, lashed to the deck and to each other with rope. From this mast hung a single square sail, a large panel of woven material on which Eric Hesselberg, the crew's navigator and also its most artistically gifted member, had painted a face. The face was that of Kon-Tiki, the sun god of the Inca, the figure from whom Heyerdahl had taken the name for both his raft and his theory. In Inca tradition, Kon-Tiki was associated with the sun and with origins, and in some accounts he was the figure who had led a group of people westward from South America before being displaced by a later culture. The painting on the sail was bold and simple, a stylized face with geometric features, visible from a distance. It gave the raft an identity, which felt appropriate. A vessel attempting something this significant probably deserved a face. Behind the mast, positioned roughly in the middle of the deck, the crew built a small cabin from bamboo and plaited bamboo mats. It was not large, perhaps 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, just tall enough to sit up in but not to stand. Inside there was barely room for a few men to sleep side by side. It was shelter from the sun and from rain, a place to keep equipment dry, a place to sleep when you were not on watch. It was not comfortable by any reasonable standard, but it was something, and on an open raft in the middle of the Pacific, something is considerably better than nothing. The supplies loaded onto Kon-Tiki reflected both practical necessity and the particular requirements of the scientific argument Heyerdahl was trying to make. He wanted to demonstrate that the voyage was possible using ancient methods, but he was not going to kill his crew to make a point. There were 275 cans of military rations, American surplus from the Second World War, which had ended less than 2 years earlier. There were coconuts, many of them, both for drinking and eating. There were sweet potatoes, which were on the raft not just as food, but as a kind of living argument. The very crop whose presence in Polynesia had helped convince Heyerdahl that contact between South America and the Pacific Islands had to have happened. There were roots of other plants, water containers, a small kerosene stove for cooking, fishing equipment, and the radio gear that Haugland and Raby would use to maintain contact with the outside world. There were also scientific instruments, for weather observation, for biological sampling, for navigation. And there was a motion picture camera because Heyerdahl understood that if this voyage succeeded, the footage would matter. The naval engineers who had observed the construction and the loading were not enthusiastic about what they saw. Several of them had told Heyerdahl directly that the raft would not survive. Their concern was primarily about the balsa logs, that once exposed to continuous immersion in salt water, the wood would absorb moisture, become denser, lose its buoyancy, and eventually sink. Some estimates suggested this would happen within 2 to 3 weeks. Others were slightly more generous and gave the raft perhaps a month. Either way, the consensus among people who knew about materials and ocean conditions was that Kon-Tiki was not going to make it to Polynesia. It was going to sink somewhere in the eastern Pacific, and the crew was going to have to be rescued, which would be embarrassing and probably fatal since rescue in that part of the ocean in 1947 was not a simple matter. Heyerdahl listened to these warnings. He noted them. He continued with the preparations. This was characteristic of him. He had a quality that could be described as either stubbornness or deep conviction, depending on whether you agreed with what he was doing. He had already been told by the academic establishment that his theory was wrong. He had already been told by publishers that his manuscript was unpublishable. He had already been dismissed by anthropologists, archaeologists, and various experts in Polynesian history. One more round of professional skepticism was not going to stop him. The raft was built, the supplies were loaded, and the crew was ready. There is something worth pausing on here, which is just how unlikely this group of 6 men was as an ocean-crossing crew. Herman Watzinger was a refrigeration engineer from Trondheim, who had met Heyerdahl in New York and been persuaded to join the expedition. Knut Haugland and Torstein Rabi were both veterans of the Norwegian resistance during the Second World War. Haugland had been part of the team that sabotaged the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant in 1943, one of the most significant acts of sabotage in the entire war, and Rabi had transmitted intelligence from occupied Norway under considerable personal danger. Erik Hesselberg was Heyerdahl's oldest friend, a painter and navigator who had sailed before but not on anything quite like this. Bengt Danielsson was a Swedish sociologist who had been doing fieldwork in South America when he heard about the expedition and asked to join, partly for the scientific interest, partly because he apparently just wanted to go. None of them were professional sailors, none of them had the ocean crossing experience. Between the 6 of them, they had a remarkable collection of skills and a more modest collection of relevant maritime knowledge. The Peruvian Navy, for their part, had been generous and helpful throughout the construction. They had provided the use of the naval yard at Callao, had assisted with logistics, had arranged for the tug that would tow Kon-Tiki out of the harbour and into open water. There was a certain amount of national pride involved. Peru was the country from which the voyage was departing, and if the expedition succeeded, Peru would have played a role in one of the great ocean journeys of the 20th century. If it failed, well, the raft had been built by a Norwegian. When the day of departure arrived, and the tug took the line and began to pull Kon-Tiki out through the harbour, the raft moved through the water with a kind of slow, deliberate dignity. The logs sat deep enough to be stable, shallow enough to be buoyant. The bamboo deck flexed slightly as small harbour waves passed under the hull, and the whole structure made a quiet creaking sound. Wood against wood, rope under tension, the sound of something large and heavy that was also, improbably, floating. The crew stood on deck and watched the shore of Callao recede. Some of them had been in Lima long enough to feel something like attachment to the city, or at least to solid ground. Some of them were simply looking at the water ahead. The tug pulled them approximately 50 miles offshore before the line was cast off. 50 miles is far enough that you cannot see the coast, far enough that the water around you is deep ocean rather than coastal shelf, far enough that the Humboldt Current, the great cold upwelling that moves northwest along the South American coast, had them fully in its grip. When the tug turned back toward Callao and its wake faded and the sound of its engine disappeared, the silence on Kon-Tiki was something the crew would remember for a long time. Not a frightening silence exactly, but a very complete one. The Pacific is not actually silent. There is always wind, always the sound of water moving, but the absence of any mechanical sound, any engine, any human infrastructure beyond what was on the raft itself, was striking in a way that was hard to prepare for. They were alone in a way that very few people in 1947 had experienced, and very few people in any era have experienced. The raft began to move. The current took it. The sail filled with the southeast trade wind. The bow, such as it was the pointed end of the 9 logs, turned northwest, and the journey began in earnest. They had covered perhaps 50 miles with the help of the tug. They had approximately 4,250 miles left to go. The balsa logs were wet, the hemp ropes were taut, and somewhere ahead of them, past the horizon and past the next horizon, and the one after that, the islands of Polynesia were waiting. Whether the raft would make it, there was a question that only the ocean could answer. And the ocean, in those first hours, was not giving anything away. What the crew did not know yet, what they could not know until they had lived it, was what it actually felt like to be carried across the Pacific on a vessel that moved with the water rather than through it. A conventional ship is designed to maintain its shape against the sea, to resist the movement of waves, to hold its structure rigid. Kon-Tiki did none of that. The lashed logs could move relative to each other. The whole raft could flex and twist as waves passed under it. This was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. And in the days ahead, as the crew adjusted to the motion and the motion adjusted to them, they would begin to understand something that the ancient builders of such rafts had understood long before them, that flexibility in the right circumstances is a form of strength. The ocean ahead of them was going to test that idea in ways they had not yet imagined. The first full night at sea was, by Heyerdahl's own account, one of the hardest things he had ever experienced. He wrote about it later with a candour that is easy to appreciate. This was not a man performing bravery for the page. He admitted that lying on the bamboo deck in the dark, feeling the raft move beneath him in ways that no solid ground ever moves, listening to the logs groan and the ropes creak and the water rush between the gaps in the hull, he was genuinely frightened, not panicked, but frightened in the quiet, sustained way that comes when you have done something that cannot be undone, and the full weight of it is only now becoming clear. The coast of Peru was 50 miles behind them. There was no going back, not really. The Humboldt Current was already doing what currents do. It was carrying them indifferently northwest. The Humboldt Current is a cold water upwelling that runs along the western coast of South America, and in the open ocean it merges into the South Equatorial Current, which flows westward across the Pacific toward Polynesia. This was, in a sense, the whole argument Heyerdahl had been making for years, that the currents themselves were a kind of road, that the ocean was not a barrier but a pathway, and that ancient people standing on the coast of Peru would have found themselves carried west if they simply got on the water. In those first hours, with the raft moving at roughly 2 to 3 knots in the current's grip, the argument was proving itself in the most immediate and physical way possible. They were going west. They had no choice but to go west. The current had decided. What the current had not decided was how comfortable the journey would be, and in those first days the answer was not very. The raft's motion was unlike anything the crew had experienced. A conventional ship rides waves by climbing them and descending them. The hull held rigid by its own structure. Kon-Tiki did something different. The 9 balsa logs could shift slightly against each other, the hemp lashings stretching and contracting, so that the whole raft absorbed the energy of waves rather than fighting them. The effect, from the perspective of someone standing on the bamboo deck, was a kind of slow, 3-dimensional rolling, not violent but constant, and deeply disorienting to a body that had spent its entire life on solid ground. The deck was also wet. It was always wet. Water washed over the logs continuously, running between the gaps, pooling on the bamboo, soaking into clothing and boots and sleeping gear. The small bamboo cabin offered some shelter, but not from the moisture. Everything on Kon-Tiki was damp within the first 24 hours, and it would stay damp for the next 100 days. Seasickness arrived quickly for some of the crew and took its time with others. Heyerdahl was among those who suffered it early and badly. He described the particular misery of being seasick on a raft. There is no going below decks to lie still, no engine noise to drown out the sound of the ocean, no way to escape the motion because the motion is everywhere, in every surface you touch, in every direction you look. You are, in the most literal sense, part of the sea's movement. Some of the crew recovered within a day or two. Others took longer. Bengt Danielsson, the Swedish sociologist who had joined partly out of intellectual curiosity, and partly, one suspects, because he had not thought it through completely, managed to be seasick and philosophical about it simultaneously, which is either admirable or simply Swedish. By the 3rd day, most of the crew had found their sea legs, or at least made a truce with the motion. What surprised them, once the worst of the initial adjustment had passed, was how stable the raft actually was. This was not what the naval engineers in Callao had predicted. Several experienced sailors and engineers had looked at Kon-Tiki before departure and expressed serious doubts, not just about the balsa logs becoming waterlogged, but about the basic seaworthiness of the design. A flat raft with no keel, no rigid hull, no mechanical propulsion, in open ocean. The skepticism was entirely reasonable. And yet, within the first week, the crew began to notice something that would only become clearer as the voyage continued. The raft did not capsize. It did not pitch violently. It did not feel like it was about to come apart. The flexibility that had seemed like a structural weakness was functioning exactly as Heyerdahl had theorized it would. The logs moved with the water, and in doing so they stayed on top of it. Eric Hesselberg, who was responsible for navigation, began taking sextant readings on the third day. A sextant works by measuring the angle between the sun or a star and the horizon, and from that angle, combined with the time, a navigator can calculate latitude and longitude. It is a method that has been used at sea for centuries, and Hesselberg was competent with it, though the raft's constant motion made the readings more difficult than they would have been from a stable ship's deck. He plotted their position on a chart each day and marked their progress. In those first days, the numbers were encouraging. The current was pushing them at a reasonable pace. If it held, they had a chance of reaching Polynesia in roughly 3 months. Provided the raft held together, the weather cooperated and nothing else went wrong. These were admittedly substantial provisions. The steering, or what passed for it, was a daily challenge. Kon-Tiki had no rudder in any conventional sense. At the stern, 2 long oars could be used to make broad adjustments to the raft's heading, but they required constant effort and gave only rough control. The more sophisticated steering mechanism was the guaras, vertical wooden boards that could be lowered between the balsa logs at various points along the raft's length. By adjusting which guaras were down and how deep, the crew could influence the raft's direction, using the resistance of the boards against the water to pivot the vessel. This was an Inca technology, documented in the Spanish accounts of the 16th century, and it was genuinely clever. The Spanish sailors who had first observed it had not understood how it worked. They had assumed the boards were simply anchors or stabilizers. In fact, the guaras functioned as a kind of distributed, adjustable rudder system, and once the crew on Kon-Tiki figured out how to use them effectively, they found they had considerably more directional control than they had initially expected. Not enough to sail against the current, but enough to steer within it, to choose between courses that the current would permit. By the end of the first week, something had shifted in the mood on the raft. The seasickness had mostly passed. The crew had established a basic routine. The fear of the first night had not disappeared exactly, but it had been absorbed into the daily reality of the voyage. It had become background rather than foreground. Heyerdahl noted in his journal that there was a strange peace to being out there, once you accepted that the ocean was in charge. There was nothing to do about the wind or the current. You could not negotiate with them. You could only work with what they gave you, and in that enforced simplicity there was something almost restful. This is a feeling that people who have spent long periods at sea often describe, a kind of surrender to scale that ends up being calming rather than terrifying. The Pacific is so vast and a raft is so small that anxiety about the vastness eventually becomes pointless. You're already in it. You might as well look around, and there was a great deal to look at. The ocean around Kon-Tiki in those first days was alive in ways that surprised the crew. Flying fish were the first revelation. These are real fish, members of the family Exoquetidae, that can leap from the water and glide on extended pectoral fins for distances of up to 200 meters. They do this to escape predators, and they do it frequently, and at night they navigate by the light of the moon. On Kon-Tiki, which carried a lantern, the flying fish were attracted to the light and often landed directly on the deck. The crew would wake in the morning to find a dozen or more fish lying on the bamboo, ready to be collected and cooked. It sounds almost too convenient, and yet this is what happened repeatedly across the entire voyage. The ocean was, in a very practical sense, feeding them. They had brought provisions, the 275 cans of food, the coconuts, the military rations, but the flying fish reduced their dependence on those supplies considerably, and the fish were fresher than anything that came from a can. Beyond the flying fish, the water around the raft was populated with creatures the crew had not expected to encounter so directly. Dolphin fish, which most people now know as mahi-mahi, followed the raft for days at a time, attracted by the shade the logs provided and the smaller fish that gathered in that shade. Sharks appeared regularly, not in the dramatic circling fashion of popular imagination, but as a constant, unhurried presence. Several species were observed, including blue sharks and oceanic white tips. The crew developed a matter-of-fact relationship with the sharks, neither panicking nor being cavalier. When a shark came too close to the stern, where the steering oars were being worked, someone would grab it by the tail, a technique that apparently works because a shark grabbed by the tail cannot easily turn to bite and throw it clear of the raft. This sounds like an extraordinary thing to do, and it was, but it also became routine in the way that many extraordinary things become routine when you do them often enough. The whale shark appeared in the second week. Rhincodon typus, the largest fish in the ocean, a filter feeder that can reach 12 meters in length and poses no threat to humans, but is, when encountered at close range from a small wooden raft, an object of considerable awe. The one that found Kon-Tiki circled the raft for hours, its enormous spotted back occasionally breaking the surface, its mouth, wide enough to swallow a man whole, though it would have no interest in doing so, passing within meters of the logs. The crew watched it with something between wonder and nervous respect. Heyerdahl wrote that it was one of the most extraordinary things he had ever seen. The whale shark eventually lost interest and descended back into the blue, and the raft continued west, and the crew stood at the stern for a while afterward, not saying very much. The psychological dimension of those first days is worth considering carefully, because 6 men in a small space with no possibility of escape from each other is a situation that has ended many expeditions in conflict and misery. Heyerdahl was aware of this risk. He had thought about it before departure. He had chosen his crew partly on the basis of temperament. These were men who seemed, individually, to be self-contained and even-keeled, not prone to dramatic emotional swings or territorial behaviour. Whether that assessment was accurate or whether the circumstances simply demanded the best from everyone is hard to say. What is clear from the journals and from Heyerdahl's later account is that the crew got along remarkably well. There were tensions, inevitably, moments of irritability, differences of opinion about small practical matters, the particular friction that comes from being unable to be alone. But there was no serious conflict. No one threatened to quit, which would have been a meaningless gesture anyway. No one stopped speaking to anyone else for more than a few hours. They worked together, ate together, kept watch together, and slept in shifts in the small bamboo cabin, their bodies close enough that warmth was shared whether they wanted to share it or not. Part of what helped was the work itself. There was always something to do on Kon-Tiki. The steering required constant attention. The ropes needed checking. The radio equipment had to be maintained. Fish had to be caught and cleaned. The sextant readings had to be taken and plotted. Heyerdahl himself kept detailed journals and collected biological specimens, plankton samples, fish, anything that came aboard the raft or could be scooped from the water. The scientific purpose of the voyage was not just the theoretical argument about migration, it was also a genuine effort to document what lived in this part of the ocean at sea level, which was less well understood in 1947 than it is today. Every unusual creature that appeared was noted, measured if possible, and recorded. The snake mackerel would come later in the voyage, but even in these early weeks the crew was encountering things that Heyerdahl found scientifically interesting, evidence that the surface layer of the open Pacific was far richer and more populated than most people imagined. At night, the plankton glowed. This is bioluminescence, produced by microscopic organisms in the water, and in the open Pacific far from any light pollution, the effect is extraordinary. The wake of the raft would light up in blue-green fire, and the wave crests around them would shimmer, and occasionally a fish moving fast through the water would leave a trail of light behind it, like something from a dream. The crew sat on the deck in the evenings and watched it. There is something about that image, 6 men on a raft in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by glowing water, the stars overhead undimmed by any artificial light, the Southern Cross visible on clear nights. That is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind without feeling something. Not envy, exactly. Something quieter than that. A recognition, maybe, that the world contains experiences so far outside ordinary life that most people will never come close to them, and that these 6 men, whatever happened next, were having one of those experiences right now. They had been at sea for about 10 days when the initial terror and disorientation had fully given way to something else. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of competence. The raft was moving. The current was reliable. The flying fish kept coming. The ropes were holding. The balsa logs, despite the warnings, were not sinking. The ocean was enormous and indifferent and occasionally terrifying, and also, in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not been there, beautiful. They were moving at roughly 40 to 50 miles per day, which meant they had covered perhaps 400 miles from the coast of Peru. 400 miles sounds like a lot until you remember that they had more than 4,000 left to go. The chart Hesselberg kept showed their track as a thin, tentative line pushing west into an enormous blue emptiness. But the line was there. It was real. And every day, it grew a little longer. Ahead of them, the Pacific continued in every direction without apparent end, and the currents that had been carrying people and ideas and seeds across this ocean for thousands of years were carrying them too, westward, toward whatever was waiting on the other side. The days that followed would test the raft and the crew in ways that went well beyond the discomfort of those first seasick nights, and the ocean was not finished showing them what it was capable of. But before any of those tests arrived, there was simply the daily life of the raft. And daily life on Kon-Tiki, once the initial shock of being at sea had settled into routine, had a rhythm that the crew adapted to more naturally than almost anyone watching from shore would have predicted. The mornings usually began with fish, flying fish specifically. These are remarkable creatures, small, silver, with enlarged pectoral fins that allow them to launch themselves from the water and glide for distances of up to 200 meters, sometimes longer, skimming just above the surface at speeds that seem impossible for something that size. They are not trying to be caught, they are fleeing predators below. But when a large flat object like a raft is sitting in the water in the dark, flying fish frequently misjudge their trajectory and land on deck rather than back in the ocean. On a calm night, the crew might wake to find 20 or more of them scattered across the bamboo planking, still flapping, some of them already dead. It became one of the more reliable food sources of the voyage. The men would gather them in the morning, clean them, and cook them on the small kerosene stove inside the cabin. Heyerdahl described the taste as delicate and mild, something like a cross between herring and mackerel. After a few weeks at sea, the crew had developed a fairly detailed opinion about which preparation method worked best, which is the kind of thing that happens when you eat the same fish every morning for months. The kerosene stove was small, not much more than a single burner, and it sat inside the bamboo cabin where it was sheltered from the wind and spray. The cabin itself was not large, perhaps 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, just enough for a few men to sit or lie down at once. It was built in the traditional Polynesian style that Heyerdahl had researched, with bamboo walls and a roof of bamboo leaves woven together into a kind of thatch. It leaked in heavy rain. It was not warm exactly, but it was shelter, and on the open Pacific, shelter from the wind matters more than almost anything else. The cabin was where men slept during their off-watch hours, where the radio equipment was stored, where the logbooks and charts were kept, where the crew retreated when the deck became too wet or too cold, or simply when they needed to be in a smaller space for a while. The watch system ran on 4-hour rotations, 2 men on deck at all times. This meant that at any given moment, 2 people were awake and responsible for the raft. 2 were sleeping, and the remaining 2 were somewhere in between, eating, doing maintenance, tending to equipment, or simply sitting at the stern watching the water go by. It was a practical arrangement, borrowed from maritime tradition, and it worked reasonably well. The men on watch were responsible for steering, which meant managing the 2 long oars at the stern and keeping an eye on the sail, and for watching for anything unusual in the water or weather. 4 hours is a long time to stare at the ocean alone at night, but it is also apparently not unpleasant. Several of the crew members wrote later about the particular quality of night watch on the open Pacific. The way the darkness was not quite dark because of the stars and the bioluminescence. The way the silence was not quite silent because of the water and the wind and the slow groaning of the logs. The parrot, Larita, had been a gift in Peru. She was a small green parrot with strong opinions about who she liked, and a habit of sitting on the edge of the cabin roof and watching the ocean with what Heyerdahl described as a look of deep, philosophical concern. She had adapted to life at sea better than some of the crew had in the first days, which the men found both amusing and slightly humbling. She ate flying fish scraps and bits of biscuit and occasionally said things in Spanish that the crew could not fully translate. She had become, in the way that animals on long voyages tend to, a kind of emotional anchor, something small and warm and alive that belonged to the world they had left behind and had come along anyway. The crew was fond of her, in the understated way that people who are not sentimental tend to be fond of animals they have been living with for weeks. And then one day, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, a wave came over the deck and Larita was gone. It happened quickly, the way these things do. One moment she was there, and then she was not. Heyerdahl noted it in his journal without excessive drama. But the absence was felt. The cabin roof looked different without her. The ocean around the raft was not empty. This is something that surprised the crew, and it is something that still surprises people who think of the open ocean as a kind of blue desert. It is not. It is full of life, and much of that life was drawn to Kon-Tiki in the way that sea creatures are drawn to any large floating object. Because floating objects create shade, attract smaller organisms, and smaller organisms attract larger ones, until a raft in the middle of the Pacific becomes its own small ecosystem. The crew noticed this within the first week. Fish began gathering beneath the logs almost immediately. Pilot whales appeared and disappeared. Sea turtles drifted alongside for hours at a time, their ancient, patient faces just visible below the surface. Dolphins came and went in groups, moving fast and apparently just curious, circling the raft and then heading off toward whatever dolphins head off toward. And then there were the sharks. There were always sharks. The warm blue water of the equatorial Pacific is excellent shark habitat, and Kon-Tiki attracted them consistently. They were mostly blue sharks and white-tip sharks, and they circled the raft at a respectful distance most of the time. Occasionally one would come too close, nosing at the logs or bumping the stern oar, and the crew would drive it off with a boat hook, or, in some cases, by grabbing its tail fin, which is apparently an effective technique for convincing a shark to leave, though it requires a certain willingness to grab a shark's tail fin, which not everyone possesses. Heyerdahl wrote about this with something close to amusement. The sharks were not, in his telling, particularly aggressive. They were opportunistic and curious, which is most of what sharks are most of the time. The crew killed a few of them over the course of the voyage when they became too persistent, hauling them onto the deck and dispatching them with a knife. Shark meat, they discovered, was edible, but not especially good. They ate it anyway. The whale-shark encounter came somewhere in the middle weeks of the voyage, and it deserves its own moment because it was genuinely unlike anything else that happened on the trip. Whale sharks are the largest fish on Earth. A fully grown individual can reach 40 feet in length and weigh more than 20 tons. They are filter feeders. They eat plankton and small fish, and they are not dangerous to humans in any practical sense. But they are so large that the distinction between dangerous and not dangerous starts to feel slightly academic when one is circling a raft. The whale shark that found Kon-Tiki was estimated by the crew to be about 45 feet long, which made it roughly the same length as the raft itself. It circled them slowly for several hours, its enormous spotted back breaking the surface now and then, its wide, flat mouth moving through the water. The crew watched it from the edge of the deck. Someone tried to plant a harpoon in it, more out of instinct than any practical plan, and the harpoon bounced off. The whale shark seemed unbothered. It continued its slow, massive circuit of the raft and eventually descended and was gone. What the crew was experiencing in aggregate was an education in what the open Pacific actually is. Not empty, not featureless, not the dead blue void that it can appear to be on a map. It was a living system, and the raft was moving through it slowly enough that they could observe it in detail. Heyerdahl collected biological specimens throughout the voyage. He had brought sample jars and basic collection equipment, and he used them. Plankton was scooped from the water in fine mesh nets and examined. Unusual fish were preserved when possible. The goal was partly scientific. Heyerdahl genuinely wanted to document what lived at the surface of the open Pacific, and partly argumentative, because one of his supporting claims was that ancient voyagers could have survived a crossing like this by eating what the ocean provided, rather than relying entirely on stored provisions. The flying fish alone, he argued, would have been enough to supplement any reasonable food supply. The evidence around him every morning seemed to support this. The stores they had brought were holding up. The 275 cans of food, the military rations, the coconuts and sweet potatoes, these were being rationed carefully, but not desperately. The fresh food they caught from the ocean reduced the pressure on the canned supplies. Water was managed through a combination of stored fresh water in cans and the collection of rainwater, which in the equatorial Pacific came in occasional heavy downpours that could fill containers quickly. Thirst was a concern in the dry stretches between rains, but it never became a crisis. Heyerdahl had done his research before departure, and the provisioning reflected that care. Bengt Danielsson, the sociologist, spent much of his time reading. He had brought 73 books aboard, which the other crew members found either admirable or slightly absurd depending on their mood. He read steadily throughout the voyage, working through his library with the methodical calm of a man who had decided that the best response to being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a wooden raft was to catch up on his reading. This is, in its way, an entirely reasonable position. Eric Hesselberg drew. He was an artist as well as a navigator, and he made sketches throughout the voyage of the raft, of the crew, of the fish and birds and sea creatures they encountered. His drawings became part of the documentary record of the expedition. Knut Haugland and Torstein Raby maintained the radio equipment with the focused attention of men who had spent the war keeping communications alive under far more stressful conditions. Hermann Watzinger took measurements and made technical observations, and Heyerdahl wrote. He wrote in his journal every day, sometimes at length, recording not just the practical facts of position and weather and food, but the texture of the experience, what the ocean looked like at different times of day, what the crew was thinking and feeling, what it meant to be doing what they were doing. By the time they had been at sea for several weeks, the initial disorientation had become something else. Not quite comfort, but a kind of orientation to a completely different way of living. The raft had its own logic now. Its rhythms were understood. The watch rotations, the morning fish, the evening star sightings, the radio schedules, the slow daily accumulation of miles. These things had become normal. The world had shrunk to the size of the raft, and within that world a kind of order had established itself. The men knew their jobs. They trusted the raft. They had stopped waiting for something to go catastrophically wrong and had started simply living with what was. The raft continued west. The Humboldt Current, which had grabbed them from the beginning, was still doing most of the work. They were averaging somewhere between 40 and 60 miles per day, depending on wind and sea conditions. Slow by any modern standard, but consistent, and consistency across a long enough time adds up. On Hesselberg's chart, the thin line of their track was no longer tentative. It had weight to it now. It was a real path across a real ocean, and it was growing longer every day. There were still more than 2,000 miles between them and the nearest Polynesian islands, and the Pacific had not yet shown them everything it was prepared to do. The storms were coming. The real dangers were still ahead, and the ocean, as patient and indifferent as ever, was waiting. While all of this was happening, The fishing, the reading, the drawing, the careful rationing of water and canned food. 2 members of the crew were doing something that, when you think about it, is almost surreal in its contrast with the surrounding circumstances. Knut Haugland and Torstein Raby were sitting inside or near the small bamboo cabin on a wooden raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, operating a radio transmitter and talking to people on the other side of the world. The radio equipment they had brought was military surplus, partly donated, partly assembled from components, and it had been waterproofed as carefully as they could manage, which on a raft that had water washing over it regularly was not a trivial concern. They had a hand-cranked generator for power. The antenna was strung up along the mast and the rigging. And from this improbable setup, Haugland and Raby managed to establish regular contact with the outside world almost from the beginning of the voyage. Both men had been radio operators during the Second World War, and not in any routine capacity. Haugland had been part of the Norwegian resistance, operating clandestine radio equipment in occupied Norway, while the Germans actively hunted for him. Raby had done similar work, at one point transmitting intelligence about the German battleship Tirpitz from a position so close to the ship that discovery would have meant immediate execution. These were men who had maintained radio contact under conditions of genuine mortal danger, with equipment they had to hide and protect from trained searchers. The Pacific, with all its difficulties, was in some ways a more comfortable operating environment. Nobody was trying to find them in order to arrest them. They transmitted on a schedule, and they were received by amateur radio operators, ham radio enthusiasts, scattered across North and South America and eventually further afield. One of the contacts they established early in the voyage was with a young man in Los Angeles, a teenage radio amateur who had picked up their signal and responded. For several weeks, this boy served as a relay point for messages between Kon-Tiki and the outside world, passing along position reports and receiving news in return. There is something quietly wonderful about that detail. A wooden raft crossing the Pacific crewed by 6 Norwegians attempting to prove an anthropological theory, relaying messages through a teenager in California who happened to be listening on the right frequency at the right moment. The position reports were important. Every day, Eric Hesselberg would take a sighting with the sextant, measuring the angle of the sun at noon or the stars at night against the horizon, and calculate their latitude and longitude. This information was then transmitted by radio so that people on shore could track the raft's progress. Hesselberg was a trained navigator, and his calculations were careful and methodical. But navigation by sextant on a moving, flexing raft in open ocean is not a simple matter. The horizon from raft level is close, and the raft's own motion introduces error into sextant readings. He cross-checked his calculations where he could, used multiple star sites when conditions permitted, and kept a running chart of their track. The position they reported each day was as accurate as the tools and conditions allowed. What the position report showed, day by day, was the work of the currents. The Humboldt Current, which flows north along the coast of South America and then bends westward into the open Pacific, had caught them almost immediately after departure and carried them northwest and then west with a consistency that was, in retrospect, exactly what Heyerdahl had predicted. He had argued, based on his observations on the Marquesas and his study of historical accounts, that the ocean's own movement would do most of the work. A raft or a vessel that simply stayed afloat and did not fight the current would be carried westward across the Pacific in a matter of months. The Humboldt Current eventually connects to the South Equatorial Current, which continues the westward push across the tropical Pacific toward Polynesia. Together, these two currents form something like a natural conveyor belt. Not a fast one, and not a perfectly straight one, but a persistent, reliable westward drift that does not require a navigator to understand it. It just requires a vessel that can stay afloat long enough to be carried. This was the central point Heyerdahl was trying to demonstrate, and the radio position reports were his daily evidence. He was not trying to prove that ancient South Americans had definitely made this voyage. He was trying to prove that the voyage was physically possible, that the ocean itself would cooperate, that the currents ran in the right direction, that a raft of the appropriate design could survive the crossing. Every day that Kon-Tiki continued west, the argument got a little stronger. The steering system deserved some attention here, because it was one of the more technically interesting aspects of the voyage, and also one of the things that surprised the crew in practice. The raft had 2 long steering oars mounted at the stern, heavy, awkward things that required real effort to move and offered only limited control. In rough conditions, steering with the oars alone was nearly impossible. But the raft also had a system that Heyerdahl had researched specifically from historical accounts of Inca sailing technology. The guiaras. Guiaras were vertical wooden boards, roughly the shape and size of a large paddle, that could be pushed down between the balsa logs and into the water. By adjusting how deep different guiaras were inserted and which ones were deployed at the bow versus the stern, the crew could change the underwater profile of the raft and alter its tendency to drift in a particular direction. It was not a rudder in the conventional sense. It did not give sharp, responsive directional control. But it was a genuine steering mechanism, and it worked, slowly, subtly, but reliably enough that the crew could make meaningful adjustments to their course over time. What makes this particularly interesting is that when Spanish explorers first encountered Inca balsa rafts in the early 16th century, they observed the guiaras but did not understand what they were for. The Spanish accounts describe the boards being pushed down between the logs, but the observers apparently assumed they were some kind of structural element or stabilizer. The actual function, that they were a form of centerboard allowing directional control, was not grasped. It took Heyerdahl's research into the historical accounts, combined with practical experimentation on Kon-Tiki itself, to work out how the system actually functioned. Once the crew understood it, they used it throughout the voyage. Eric Hesselberg, as navigator, became particularly skilled at adjusting the guiaras to maintain the best possible heading. The combination of the oars for course adjustments and the guiaras for fine-tuning gave them more control than the naval engineers back in Peru had expected a raft of this type to have. None of this meant they could sail wherever they wanted. The raft could not sail against the wind or make significant headway against the current. Their ability to steer was real but limited. They could influence their direction within a range of maybe 20 to 30 degrees off the wind, but they could not reverse course or make sharp turns. In practical terms, they were committed to the general direction the current was taking them. What the steering system gave them was the ability to make smaller choices within that larger constraint, to angle slightly north or south, to avoid an obstacle, to aim toward a particular point on the horizon. For crossing an ocean on a raft, that was enough. Heyerdahl noted in his journal that working out the guiara system in practice felt like a genuine discovery. He had read about it in the historical sources, had understood it intellectually, but actually deploying the boards and feeling the raft respond, slowly, gradually but unmistakably, was something different. It connected him, he wrote, to the Inca sailors who had developed and used this technology centuries before. They had understood something about fluid dynamics and underwater resistance that the Spanish observers had completely missed, and the proof of that understanding was right there in the behaviour of the raft. The radio contacts also served a practical scientific function beyond position reporting. Heyerdahl and the crew were making observations throughout the voyage about ocean temperature, about the species of fish and birds they encountered, about weather patterns, about the behaviour of the raft in different sea conditions, and they transmitted some of these observations by radio to researchers on shore. The biological specimens Heyerdahl was collecting were being catalogued and described. The plankton samples, the preserved fish, the notes on whale shark behaviour, and the movements of pilot whale pods. All of this was being recorded with the intention of contributing to scientific knowledge about the open Pacific. One contact in particular stands out. At some point during the voyage, the crew made radio contact with a research station that was tracking weather patterns in the Pacific, and they exchanged information about current sea conditions in their area. The raft was, in effect, functioning as a remote weather observation platform, one of very few human presences in that vast stretch of ocean. The data they could provide about wave height, wind direction, cloud cover, and sea temperature in real time was genuinely useful to meteorologists who had almost no other source of surface-level observations from that part of the Pacific. This was not the primary purpose of the voyage, but it was a real contribution. There was also, running underneath all the scientific observation and radio contact and careful navigation, a quieter kind of learning happening. The crew was learning what the open Pacific actually felt like to live in. Not to transit quickly on a powered vessel, not to observe from a research ship with stabilizers and a proper galley and a bunk, but to live in, to be carried by, to eat from, to sleep on the surface of. Heyerdahl had argued that ancient South Americans could have made this crossing because the ocean would sustain them. The flying fish, the dolphin fish, the rain, the plankton. The living system of the open Pacific as a source of food and water for people who knew how to use it. Every morning when the crew collected the flying fish from the deck and every time they pulled a mahi-mahi aboard, they were adding a small piece of evidence to this argument. They were not starving. They were not desperately short of water. The ocean was providing in the way Heyerdahl had predicted it would, and the stored supplies they had brought were holding up better than expected, because the fresh food from the sea was supplementing them. By the time they had been at sea for 6 or 7 weeks, it was clear that the provision in question, could people actually survive this crossing on a raft, had been answered. Yes, they could. What remained unanswered, and what would remain partially unanswered for decades after the voyage ended, was the larger question. Not whether the crossing was possible, but whether it actually happened. Not whether a raft could make it from Peru to Polynesia, but whether ancient South Americans had actually built such rafts and actually made such crossings, and actually settled in Polynesia before the Polynesians who came from the west. That question was more complicated, and the ocean's currents, however helpful they were in carrying Kon-Tiki westward, could not answer it. But the raft was still moving. The position reports were still going out each day. The line on Hesselberg's chart was still growing longer, still reaching further west across the blue expanse. The Tuamotu archipelago, the scattered chain of low coral atolls that would be their first landfall if they made landfall at all, was still more than 1,000 miles ahead. The Pacific was not finished with them yet, and the most dangerous part of the voyage, the part that would test not just the theory, but the raft itself and the men aboard it, was still somewhere out there in the water ahead. There is something worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The crew of Kon-Tiki had, by this point in the voyage, solved the problems they could solve. They had worked out the steering. They had established their routines. They were eating, sleeping, navigating, transmitting. The raft was holding together. The ocean, for all its strangeness, had become something close to familiar. And that familiarity, in a way, was its own kind of danger. Because the Pacific was not finished testing them. It had simply been patient. The first serious crisis of the voyage happened not in a storm but in a moment of ordinary movement on deck. Hermann Watzinger, the technical engineer, was working near the stern of the raft when he lost his footing. The deck of Kon-Tiki was not a stable platform. It moved constantly, rolling, pitching, shifting as the logs flexed beneath the bamboo. Water washed over it regularly. The ropes were always wet. Watzinger went over the side. In open ocean, on a raft moving with the current, a man overboard is a situation that can turn fatal in minutes. There is no stopping the vessel, no reversing course. The raft keeps moving, carried by the same current that carries everything else, and the distance between a man in the water and the raft begins to grow almost immediately. The crew had discussed what to do in exactly this situation. They had a lifebuoy, they had a rope. But discussion and reality are different things, and the moment Watzinger hit the water, everything happened very fast. Knut Haugland, who was on deck at the time, acted without hesitation. He grabbed a rope and threw it toward Watzinger. The rope reached him. Watzinger caught it. and with the help of the crew pulling from the deck, he was hauled back aboard. The whole incident lasted perhaps a minute or two, but it was close, genuinely close, and it shook the crew in a way that the ordinary discomforts of the voyage had not. Heyerdahl wrote about it afterward with a kind of controlled understatement that makes it clear how frightened they all were. Watzinger was uninjured. He was wet and shaken and probably very aware of how different the outcome could have been. After that, the crew was more careful near the edges of the raft, more aware of where they were standing, what they were holding on to, how the deck was moving beneath them. The sharks were a constant presence throughout the voyage, and they deserve more than a passing mention because they were not simply background scenery. The crew of Kon-Tiki spent 101 days surrounded by sharks, mostly blue sharks and white-tip oceanic sharks, the kind that follow large floating objects in the open ocean, drawn by the shadow and the biological activity that accumulates beneath anything drifting on the surface. The sharks circled the raft day and night. They came close enough to touch. On more than one occasion they bumped against the logs. The crew's response to this was, depending on how you look at it, either pragmatic or slightly alarming. They killed sharks by hand when they came too close, grabbing them by the tail fin as they swam past the edge of the raft, hauling them partly aboard and dispatching them. This was not bravado. It was a practical decision about managing a genuine hazard in their immediate environment. A large shark bumping against the raft repeatedly could potentially dislodge something, or could be a risk to anyone working at the edge of the deck. The crew treated the sharks the way a farmer might treat a persistent and dangerous animal near the property, with respect, with caution, and when necessary with force. Heyerdahl himself found the sharks fascinating as much as threatening. He observed their behaviour carefully and wrote about it in detail. He noted the way they would approach slowly, circle, approach again, the way they seemed to be assessing rather than attacking, the way the presence of the raft itself seemed to create a kind of floating ecosystem, the sharks following the raft because the raft attracted fish, and the fish attracted because of the shadow and the biological material that accumulated beneath the logs. The raft was not just a vessel, it was a habitat, and the sharks were part of that habitat. The storm, when it came, was something different from anything else they encountered. It arrived somewhere around the midpoint of the voyage. The accounts place it roughly in the 6th or 7th week at sea, though the exact timing varies slightly depending on the source. The sky changed over the course of an afternoon. The wind picked up. The swell, which had been the long rolling Pacific swell they had grown accustomed to, began to steepen and shorten. By evening the waves were running high enough that the crew could no longer see the horizon from deck level when the raft was in a trough between two swells. The wave heights during the storm reached somewhere around 15 to 20 feet. On a large ship that would be uncomfortable but manageable, on a raft 45 feet long sitting at water level, with no freeboard to speak of, it was something else entirely. The waves broke over the deck. The cabin, small as it was, provided almost no shelter from the water that was constantly washing across the logs. The crew lashed themselves to the raft and held on. What saved them, in a real sense, was the same property of the raft that had surprised them in the first days of the voyage, the flexibility of the lashed logs. A rigid vessel in those conditions would have been working against the waves, fighting each one, absorbing the impact as a structural shock. Kon-Tiki moved with the waves instead. The logs shifted and flexed. The raft bent rather than broke. The hemp ropes, soaked and stretched, held. The raft did not swamp, though there were moments when it seemed like it might. The water that washed over the deck ran off through the gaps between the logs. The bamboo cabin was battered but survived. The mast flexed alarmingly but did not come down. Heyerdahl described the experience of lying lashed to the raft during the worst of the storm as one of the most terrifying nights of his life. The noise was enormous. The groaning of the logs, the sound of the waves, the wind in the rigging. The physical sensation was relentless. There was no dry place on the raft. There was no shelter from the movement. All 6 men could do was hold on and wait for it to pass. and eventually it did. By morning the wind had eased and the swell was dropping. The raft was still afloat. The crew was exhausted and soaked and, by Heyerdahl's account, profoundly relieved. The storm left its marks. Some of the ropes had worked loose and needed retying. A section of the bamboo deck had been damaged. Various supplies that had not been secured properly were gone, but the fundamental structure of the raft, the 9 balsa logs, the lashings, the mast, had held. The naval engineers back in Callao who had predicted the raft would become waterlogged and sink had been wrong, but the storm was a reminder that wrong does not mean impossible. The ocean had other ways of ending the voyage if it chose to. One of the stranger moments of the entire journey came not during a storm, but on a calm night, somewhere in the middle weeks of the voyage. The crew was on watch in the usual rotation, the sea relatively quiet, when something came aboard that none of them had ever seen before. It landed on the deck in the dark, a large, unfamiliar creature roughly 3 feet long, with enormous eyes and a body built for deep water. It was a snake mackerel, known scientifically as Gempolis serpens, a deep-sea species. Not something that was supposed to be at the surface at all, and certainly not something that was supposed to be leaping onto passing rafts in the middle of the night. The crew had no idea what it was at first. The creature was alive and moving when they found it, and it apparently bit at least one crew member before it could be secured. Heyerdahl was fascinated. He preserved the specimen carefully and later brought it back for scientific examination. Marine biologists confirmed the identification, and the find was genuinely interesting to the scientific community, not because the species was unknown, but because live specimens at the surface were almost never encountered. The deep ocean was occasionally sending things upward, it seemed, in ways that were not fully understood. Heyerdahl added it to his growing collection of biological observations from the voyage, noting it as evidence that the boundary between deep water and surface was more permeable, more active than people assumed. By the final weeks of the voyage, the raft itself was showing the strain of more than 2 months at sea. The hemp ropes, which had been soaked in seawater for the entire crossing, had stretched and worked against the logs with every movement of the ocean. They had cut grooves into the balsa wood, some of them an inch or more deep, from the constant friction. The balsa logs had absorbed more water than the skeptics had predicted they would, and less than the skeptics had feared. Some of the outer logs were noticeably softer than they had been at departure, the waterlogged wood giving slightly under pressure. The bamboo deck was worn and damaged in places. The cabin had been patched and repaired multiple times, and yet the raft held. The central structure, those 9 logs, bound together with rope in the Inca manner, remained sound. The logs had not separated. The lashings, stretched and grooved and salt-encrusted as they were, had not failed. Heyerdahl noted this with something approaching wonder. The raft had been designed for exactly this voyage by people who understood exactly what the ocean would do to it, and it was performing as designed. Not perfectly, not without wear, but it was performing. There is something quietly remarkable about this, when you think about it. The naval engineers who had warned the raft would sink were not foolish. They were applying the standards of modern marine engineering to a vessel that operated on completely different principles. Modern vessels are designed to resist the ocean, to maintain their rigidity, their shape, their structural integrity against the forces of wave and wind. The Inca balsa raft was designed to yield to the ocean, to move with it, to flex, to let the water through rather than fight it. 2 completely different philosophies of construction, and the modern engineers had simply not recognized the validity of the older one. The voyage was, in this sense, an argument not just about ancient migration, but about ancient engineering. And the raft was winning that argument one day at a time. The crew by this point was tired. Not broken, not desperate, but genuinely worn down by the accumulation of weeks at sea. The watch rotations continued. The fishing continued. The radio contacts continued. Hesselberg kept updating the position on his chart. But the novelty of the early weeks had long since faded, and what remained was something more like endurance, the quiet, unglamorous work of continuing to do what needed to be done, day after day, on a raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Heyerdahl wrote in his journal during these final weeks about the strange compression of time that had set in. Days that were eventful felt short, days that were uneventful felt long, and then, in retrospect, blurred together with all the other uneventful days. The ocean looked the same in every direction. The sky changed, but within a limited range of variations. The crew had been together for so long in such a small space that they had, in a sense, run out of things to say to each other and arrived at a kind of comfortable silence. Not hostile silence, just the silence of people who know each other well enough that words are not always necessary. What kept them going, in part, was the knowledge that land was out there somewhere ahead. The Tuamotu archipelago, the scattered chain of low coral atolls that mark the outer edge of Polynesia, was drawing closer with every day the current carried them westward. They could not see it yet. They could not smell it yet. But the position reports told them it was there, and the line on Hesselberg's chart was getting close to the edge of the open ocean and the beginning of something else. The question now was not whether they would reach Polynesia. The current and the wind had made that almost certain for weeks. The question was how they would reach it, and whether the raft, worn and grooved and softened as it was, would survive the encounter with a coral reef that could tear the bottom out of a vessel far sturdier than Kon-Tiki. The Tuamotu archipelago was not a welcoming coastline. It was a field of coral, barely above sea level, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, with reefs that had wrecked ships far more capable of manoeuvring than a wooden raft with no engine and limited steering. The crew knew this. They had known it for weeks. And as the days shortened the distance, that knowledge was sitting a little heavier than it had before. The birds were the first sign. More of them, and different species. Birds that did not range as far from land as the ones the crew had been seeing throughout the voyage. Then floating vegetation, clumps of it drifting past the raft, torn from somewhere shallow. The colour of the water changed slightly, in ways that were hard to describe but unmistakable once you had been watching the same ocean long enough to know what its ordinary colour looked like. Something was different. Something was ahead. And the raft, carrying its 6 tired men and its worn ropes and its grooved logs, was moving toward it whether they were ready or not. On the morning of July 30th, 1947, Eric Hesselberg was checking his position when the calculation confirmed what the birds and the water and the floating vegetation had already been suggesting for several days. They were close. Not close in the way that a ship with an engine is close, where you can adjust your course, slow down, approach on your own terms. Close in the way that a raft carried by a current is close, which means the ocean has decided for you, and what comes next is largely out of your hands. The Tuamotu archipelago is a strange kind of landfall. It is not a coastline in any ordinary sense. It is a collection of coral atolls, low, flat rings of reef enclosing shallow lagoons, scattered across roughly 1,000 miles of ocean in a rough northwest to southeast chain. From a distance, and even from a moderate distance, most of them are essentially invisible. Coral atolls in the Tuamotu sit only a few feet above sea level. There are no mountains, no headlands, no cliffs to catch the eye from 10 or 15 miles out. What you might see, if conditions were right, was the dark green smudge of coconut palms against the sky. But even that required you to be close enough that the reef itself was already a concern. For sailors throughout history, the Tuamotu earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the Pacific. The French called them the Dangerous Archipelago. Ships with full crews and working engines and proper charts had come to grief on those reefs. The coral is hard and sharp and sits just below the surface in places, and the currents between the atolls are unpredictable. For a raft with no engine, limited steering, and a crew of 6 exhausted men, the Tuamotu were not a destination so much as a hazard that happened to be in the direction they were already travelling. Heyerdahl understood this. He had understood it for weeks, in the abstract way you understand something that is still far away. Now it was becoming concrete. Puka Puka was the first atoll they saw. It appeared on July 30th, a low dark line on the horizon that resolved, as they drew closer, into the familiar shape of palms. The crew gathered on deck. After 97 days of open ocean, the sight of land, any land, even a narrow strip of coral barely above the waterline, produced a reaction that Heyerdahl described as almost overwhelming. Not quite joy, or not only joy, something more complicated than that. Relief, maybe. The physical confirmation that the world still contained solid ground, and that they had crossed enough of the ocean to reach it. But Puka Puka was not going to let them stop. The current was carrying them past it at a pace they could not overcome with their steering oars and their guaras. They could see the atoll clearly, the palms, the white line of surf on the reef, the blue of the lagoon beyond, and they could do almost nothing about the fact that the ocean was moving them past it. They tried. They worked the steering oars and adjusted the centreboards, angling for any approach that might bring them closer. It was not enough. The current had its own opinion, and its opinion was that Puka Puka was not where Kon-Tiki was going to stop. The atoll slid past them and fell behind, and the open ocean was ahead again, and the crew stood on the deck of their worn and grooved raft and watched the first land they had seen in 3 months disappear behind them. There is something almost painful about that, when you sit with it for a moment. 97 days at sea, and then land, close enough to see the individual trees, and then gone. The crew handled it with the kind of equanimity that weeks of ocean living seem to produce in people, a quieter relationship with outcomes, a reduced expectation that things will go as you want them to. They had learned, over 97 days, that the ocean was not interested in their preferences. You adjusted, you kept going. The next atoll was Angatau, and here the situation became something more complicated and more hopeful, and then more frustrating all at once. Angatau appeared a few days after Puka Puka, and this time the approach angle was better. The current was carrying them closer rather than past, and for a period it seemed genuinely possible that Kon-Tiki might find a way into the lagoon. The atoll was inhabited, which Puka Puka was not, and this mattered enormously. People meant help. People meant the possibility of a controlled end to the voyage rather than whatever the reef had planned for them. The islanders saw the raft. Of course they did. A large wooden raft with a square sail and a painted face on it, approaching their atoll, was not something you missed. Several men came out in canoes to meet Kon-Tiki, paddling hard through the surf and out into the open water alongside the raft. Heyerdahl described the encounter with a kind of quiet wonder. These Polynesian men in their canoes, appearing out of nowhere after months of empty ocean, calling out to the crew in a language none of them spoke, gesturing toward the lagoon entrance. The canoe paddlers were trying to help. They understood better than anyone what the reef could do, and they were trying to guide the raft to safety. But Kon-Tiki could not be guided. Not precisely enough, not quickly enough. The raft had limited ability to steer at the best of times, and the currents near the atoll were working against any approach to the lagoon entrance. The crew worked the oars and adjusted the guaras and did everything they knew how to do, and the raft moved where the ocean moved it, which was not through the lagoon entrance. The canoe paddler stayed with them for a while, paddling alongside, calling out, pointing, and then the current carried the raft away from Angatau, and the canoes turned back, and the atoll fell behind like Puka Puka had fallen behind, and the crew of Kon-Tiki was back in open water. Heyerdahl wrote about this moment with a frankness that is worth noting. He did not dress it up. He said the crew was discouraged, not panicking, not despairing, but genuinely quietly discouraged. They had been close to a safe landing twice now, and had been denied both times by the simple mechanical fact that a raft cannot maneuver the way a boat can. The Tuamotu reefs were ahead of them, and the current was going to carry them into that field of coral whether they found a safe entrance or not. The question was no longer if they would hit a reef. It was becoming a question of when and how hard, and whether the raft would hold together when it did. The days after Angatau had a different quality to them. The crew prepared. They lashed down everything that could be lashed down. They secured the most important items, the logs from the voyage, the film canisters with the footage they'd been shooting throughout the journey, the radio equipment. Haugland and Raby sent position reports and let their radio contacts know that Kon-Tiki was approaching the Tuamotu reef zone. They checked and rechecked the lashings on the raft itself, tightening what could be tightened, reinforcing what could be reinforced. There was not much else to do. The ocean was going to do what the ocean was going to do, and the crew was going to be on the raft when it happened. The birds were everywhere now, dozens of them, wheeling overhead and landing on the mast and the rigging, boobies and frigate birds and terns, species that stay close to land. The smell had changed too. Even in the open ocean, still some miles from the nearest reef, there was something in the air that was different from the clean salt smell of the deep Pacific. Something organic and shallow water and alive. The smell of reef and lagoon, and the particular biology of coral, which is its own distinct thing if you know what you're smelling. Heyerdahl noticed the colour of the water again. Through the voyage, the deep Pacific had been a dark, almost indigo blue. The colour of very deep water, thousands of metres down where the light barely reaches. Now, as they moved into the shallower waters around the Tuamotu chain, the colour was shifting toward a lighter, greener blue. Not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly. The ocean floor was rising beneath them, even if they could not see it, and the water was showing it. There is something worth pausing on here. These men had spent more than 3 months reading the ocean. Not in a formal scientific sense, though. Heyerdahl was certainly observing and noting everything he could. But in the way that anyone who spends enough time in a single environment eventually learns to read it. They knew what the ordinary Pacific looked like, smelled like, felt like under the raft. They knew the sound of a normal night at sea versus the sound of a storm building. They knew what the flying fish landing on deck meant versus what an unusual species appearing near the surface meant. After 101 days, they had a relationship with the ocean that most people never develop, and that relationship was now telling them, clearly and from multiple directions, that something was close. What was close was the reef at Roroya. Roroya is an atoll in the northern Tuamotus, roughly 430 miles northeast of Tahiti. It is not a large atoll. The lagoon inside the reef is perhaps 25 miles long and 15 miles wide, enclosed by a ring of coral that sits just at or just below the waterline on the outer edge and rises to a narrow strip of land on the inner edge. The outer reef is the part that matters for a vessel approaching from the open ocean. It is hard coral, irregular, broken in places by surge channels where the ocean pushes through with tremendous force. It is not a place you want to arrive without an engine. Kon-Tiki was going to arrive without an engine. The current and the wind were carrying the raft directly toward Roroya's outer reef, and by the final day of the approach, the crew could hear it before they could see it clearly. The sound of surf breaking on coral carries across open water, a low continuous roar that is nothing like the sound of waves in open ocean. Open ocean waves make a rushing, lifting sound. Surf on a reef makes a sound like something being broken repeatedly, which is in fact exactly what it is. Water being broken against coral, over and over, relentlessly, with the full weight of the Pacific behind it. The crew heard that sound, and they knew what it meant, and they prepared as best they could. They took down the sail to reduce the speed of the approach as much as possible, though the current was going to carry them in regardless. They lashed themselves to the raft, ropes tied around their waists and secured to the logs, so that if the raft was thrown into the surf they would not be separated from it. They put on their shoes, which they had barely worn during the voyage, because coral is sharp enough to cut through bare feet in seconds. They stowed what they could and held on to what they could not stow. Haugland sent a final position report over the radio, and then there was nothing left to do but wait for what was coming. The reef appeared as a white line ahead, the surf catching the light, the roar growing louder with every minute. Behind the reef, the crew could see the calmer blue of the lagoon, and beyond that the thin green line of the atoll's interior. It looked peaceful from a distance. The reef itself did not look peaceful. It looked like what it was, a wall of coral with the entire Pacific Ocean pushing against it. Kon-Tiki struck the outer reef on August 7th, 1947, 101 days after leaving Callao, Peru, approximately 4,300 miles of open ocean behind them and a coral reef directly ahead, and 6 men holding onto a wooden raft that was about to find out what it was made of in the most literal possible sense. The first wave lifted the raft and drove it into the coral. Then the next wave came, and the next, each one pushing the raft further across the reef, grinding the logs against the coral, filling the air with spray and noise. The cabin collapsed. The mast broke. The steering oars were gone. The crew held onto the ropes they had tied themselves to, and held onto the logs and held onto each other and let the ocean do what the ocean was going to do. There was no steering now, no decisions to make, no actions to take. There was only the raft and the reef and the waves and the noise and the waiting for it to stop. It stopped when the raft was pushed over the reef and into the lagoon. The transition from the violence of the reef to the calm of the lagoon happened in a matter of seconds, and Heyerdahl described it as one of the strangest sensations of the entire voyage. The sudden quiet, the flat water, the raft drifting gently in the enclosed lagoon, while the surf continued to roar on the reef behind them. The cabin was gone. The mast was broken. The deck was damaged. The logs were scraped and gouged. But the raft was floating. The lashings had held through everything the reef had thrown at them, and the 9 balsa logs were still together, still bound in the Inca manner, still carrying 6 men who were miraculously all alive and all essentially unhurt. They had crossed the Pacific, not cleanly, not gracefully, not on their own terms. The ocean had never really been interested in their terms, but they had crossed it. The raft had carried them from Peru to Polynesia in 101 days, on the same currents that Heyerdahl believed had carried people across the same water centuries before. They had proved the journey was possible. What it meant, what it proved, or did not prove about ancient migration, was a question for later. Right now there was a broken mast and a destroyed cabin and a lagoon, and somewhere beyond the lagoon there was land, and the crew of Kon-Tiki was going to need a few days to find it. The lagoon at Roroya is quiet in a way that the open Pacific never quite is. The open ocean has a constant motion to it, a low restlessness, even on calm days. The swell moving under you, the raft shifting, the water always doing something. A lagoon enclosed by coral is different. The water inside is sheltered from the full force of the ocean, and what reaches it has already spent most of its energy on the reef. So the surface is flatter, the colour is a different shade of blue, something closer to green in the shallows, and the sound of the surf on the outer reef becomes background noise rather than immediate threat. It is still there, still audible, but it is behind you now. Kon-Tiki drifted in that quiet water on the morning of August 7th, 1947, and the 6 men on board took stock of what they had and what they had lost. The cabin was gone. It had been a small bamboo structure, just large enough for a few men to sleep in at a time, lashed to the deck behind the mast, and the reef had taken it. The mast was broken, snapped off during the crossing of the coral, and the sail that had carried them across 4,300 miles of open ocean was tangled in the wreckage on the deck. Several of the deck planks were gone or badly damaged. The steering oars had been torn away. The logs themselves were scraped deeply in places, gouged by the coral, but they were still together, still lashed in the same hemp rope that had been tied in Callao, Peru, 4 months earlier, still floating, still intact as a raft in any meaningful sense. The lashings had stretched and worn into the wood over 101 days at sea, cutting grooves into the balsa logs wherever rope crossed wood. but they had not broken. The naval engineers in Callao, who had predicted the raft would become waterlogged and sink, had been wrong about that, and they had been wrong about the lashings too, and the crew of Kon-Tiki had the evidence of both predictions floating beneath their feet. What they did not have was a way to move. Without the sail and without the steering oars, the raft was drifting at the mercy of the lagoon's gentle internal currents, and while that was infinitely preferable to drifting at the mercy of the outer reef, it was not going to get them anywhere useful. The lagoon at Raroya is not small. At roughly 25 miles long and 15 miles wide, it is large enough that the interior islands, the narrow strips of land on the inner edge of the atoll ring, were visible but not immediately reachable. The crew could see vegetation, could see the shape of land, but getting to it required either repairing the raft enough to sail it or finding another way across the lagoon. They managed to paddle and drift toward a small uninhabited island on the inner edge of the atoll. It was not much, a strip of coral and sand with coconut palms, the kind of place that exists all across the Tuamotu archipelago, technically land but without fresh water, without shelter beyond the palms, without anything that had not washed up from the ocean. But it was solid ground, and solid ground after 101 days on a wooden raft felt like something worth stopping for, even if the island itself was not much to stop at. They pulled the damaged raft up as best they could, and made camp on the island, and for the first time in more than 3 months they slept without the ocean moving beneath them. The disorientation of that, interestingly, is something several of the crew mentioned afterward. You spend long enough on a raft and your body adjusts to the constant motion, the slight roll, the flex of the logs, the rhythm of the ocean. When that motion stops, the stillness feels wrong for a while. The ground feels too fixed. It is the same phenomenon sailors have described for centuries, and it is one of those small details that makes the Kon-Tiki accounts feel very human and very real. These were not superhuman adventurers immune to the strangeness of what they had done. They were 6 men who had spent 101 days on a wooden raft and now found themselves lying on a coral island in the middle of the South Pacific, listening to the surf on the outer reef, trying to sleep on ground that refused to move the way their bodies expected it to. They stayed on that small island for several days. They had food, coconuts from the palms, fish from the lagoon, some remaining supplies from the raft, and they had the radio equipment, which Haugland and Raby had protected during the reef crossing. They managed to get a message out confirming their position and their survival, and somewhere far away, people who had been following the voyage, by radio, by newspaper, by the kind of anxious collective attention that long expeditions generate, received the news that Kon-Tiki had made it, or had made it across the ocean at least. Getting off Raroya was still a problem to be solved. The solution arrived in the form of islanders from the main settlement at Raroya, which is located on the inner edge of the atoll, a few miles from where the crew had come ashore. The people of Raroya were Polynesian, part of the broader Tuamotuan population, and they had heard about the strange raft that had appeared in their lagoon. Word travels quickly in island communities, even across water. A group of men came by canoe to investigate, and what they found was a damaged balsa raft, a broken mast, a pile of equipment and supplies, and 6 sunburned Europeans who were very glad to see them. The meeting, by all accounts, was warm. There was no common language. None of the Kon-Tiki crew spoke Tuamotuan, but warmth does not require language, and the islanders helped the crew salvage what could be salvaged from the raft and brought them to the main village. Heyerdahl later wrote about those days on Raroya, with a kind of quiet gratitude that comes through even in translation. The islanders fed them, housed them, celebrated with them. There was dancing and singing. There was a feast. There was the particular generosity that island communities have often shown to strangers who arrive from the sea, a generosity that has its own long history in the Pacific. The crew of Kon-Tiki had arrived in Polynesia in the most chaotic possible way, driven across a coral reef by a wave, their raft damaged and their cabin gone, and they had been received with something close to celebration. It is a detail that tends to get overshadowed by the drama of the reef crossing, but it is worth staying with for a moment. After 101 days in which the ocean had been both their path and their primary adversary, the first sustained human contact they had was this: people who came by canoe across a lagoon and welcomed them. After several days on Roroya, a French schooner arrived to take the crew and the raft to Papeete, Tahiti. The raft was partially repaired and towed rather than sailed, which was probably wise given the state of the mast and the steering system. The journey to Tahiti took a few days, and the arrival in Papeete was the crew's first encounter with the kind of reception that was going to follow them for the next several months and, in Heyerdahl's case, for the rest of his life. Papeete in 1947 was the administrative centre of French Polynesia, a port town with a long history of receiving ships from across the Pacific. It was not a place that was easily impressed by ocean voyages, but Kon-Tiki impressed it. The raft was towed into the harbour and the crew was met by crowds, by officials, by journalists who had made their way to Tahiti to cover the story. Photographs were taken. The crew, who had spent 101 days in the same clothes, eating flying fish and canned food, navigating by sextant and star, were suddenly the centre of a great deal of attention. Hermann Watzinger, who had nearly been lost overboard somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, was photographed looking sunburned and calm. Eric Hesselberg, who had navigated the Raft across 4,300 miles with a sextant and a set of charts, was photographed with the painted sail that had somehow survived the reef crossing. Heyerdahl, who had conceived the whole thing, who had no sailing experience when it began, who had spent the first night at sea in something close to terror, was photographed looking like a man who had proved something he had always believed was true. What exactly he had proved was a question that was already beginning to complicate the celebration, though that complication would take time to fully develop. In Tahiti, in August and September of 1947, the dominant narrative was simpler and more satisfying. 6 men had crossed the Pacific on a wooden raft. They had done what experts said could not be done. They had survived storms and sharks and a coral reef and 101 days of open ocean, and they had arrived. That was the story, and it was a good story, and it was true. The raft itself was carefully preserved. Despite the damage from the reef, the broken mast, the destroyed cabin, the gouged logs, Kon-Tiki was still recognisably the same raft that had been built in Callao. The 9 balsa logs were still bound together. The hemp rope lashings worn into the wood were still holding. The painted face of the sun god Kon-Tiki, which Eric Hesselberg had drawn on the sail, had survived. The raft was eventually shipped back to Norway, where it would become the centrepiece of a museum built specifically to house it. But that was still in the future. In Tahiti, in the early weeks after the landing, the raft was something the locals and the journalists and the curious came to look at. This battered, remarkable thing that had crossed an ocean. The crew began the process of making their way home. Heyerdahl and the others travelled from Tahiti back to the United States, and from there to Europe, and at each stop the reception was similar in kind, if not always in scale. People who had followed the voyage by radio and newspaper wanted to see the men who had done it. Knut Haugland and Torstein Rabi, the 2 radio operators who had kept Kon-Tiki in contact with the world throughout the voyage, were already known in Norway for their wartime service. Haugland had been part of the team that sabotaged the Nazi heavy water plant at Vemork, one of the most important acts of resistance of the Second World War. Rabi had transmitted intelligence from occupied Norway at considerable personal risk. They were not men who lacked for courage before the raft, and their presence on Kon-Tiki had given the expedition a kind of quiet credibility that pure adventurers might not have carried. These were people who had already demonstrated in other contexts that they could function under pressure. Bengt Danielsson, the Swedish sociologist who had joined the crew almost on impulse. He had met Heyerdahl in Lima and asked if he could come along, and Heyerdahl had said yes. Brought his own particular quality to the story. He had spent the voyage reading books and studying Polynesian culture, and he was, by most accounts, the calmest person on the raft throughout the entire journey. By the time the crew returned to Norway, Heyerdahl was already writing. The book that would become Kon-Tiki was written quickly, in the way that books written by people who have just done something extraordinary and need to explain it often are. It was published in Norwegian in 1948 under the title Kon-Tiki Expedition, and the response was immediate and large. The book went into multiple printings almost immediately. The translation rights were sold. Within a few years, Kon-Tiki would be available in 70 languages, read by millions of people across the world, and Thor Heyerdahl would be one of the most famous Norwegians alive, which is a category that, in Norway, carries real weight. The documentary film made from footage shot during the voyage by the crew themselves. They had brought a 16mm camera and filmed throughout the 101 days, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1951. It was not a polished film. It was footage shot by men on a moving raft in the middle of the ocean, and it looked exactly like that, which was part of what made it so compelling. The Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo opened in 1950, before the book had even finished its first wave of international success. The raft was placed on display in the condition it had arrived in, damaged, worn, real. Visitors could see the grooves the hemp rope had cut into the balsa logs. They could see the size of the thing, which photographs do not quite capture. 45 feet long, 18 feet wide, 9 logs, a bamboo deck, the stump of a broken mast. It is not an impressive-looking object in the way that a tall ship or a modern yacht is impressive. It is impressive in a different way, the way that something simple and sufficient is impressive when you understand what it was sufficient for. That raft crossed the Pacific. Those logs and those ropes crossed the Pacific. And now they sat in a museum in Oslo, and millions of people came to look at them, and most of those people probably had the same reaction, which is something close to disbelief, followed by something close to admiration. The celebration, the book, the film, the museum, all of this happened in the first few years after the voyage. But running alongside the celebration, sometimes quietly and sometimes not so quietly, was a different kind of conversation, the scientific one. The question of what the voyage had actually proved, and whether Heyerdahl's theory about ancient South American migration to Polynesia was supported by the evidence, or whether the evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. That conversation was going to be more complicated and less satisfying, and in some ways more interesting than the voyage itself. It would involve linguists and archaeologists and geneticists, and it would take decades to reach anything close to a resolution, and even then the resolution would be partial and strange, and not quite what either Heyerdahl or his critics had predicted. The ocean, it turned out, had more to say on the subject than anyone had fully anticipated, and so before we get to that scientific conversation, before the linguists and the archaeologists weigh in, it is worth staying a little longer with the human part of the story. The part that happened in the weeks and months after the reef, while the debate was still forming and the world was still learning what these 6 men had done. Raroya Atoll, where Kon-Tiki came to rest, is not a place most people have heard of. It sits in the Tuamotu archipelago, a scattered chain of low coral atolls in French Polynesia, and it is remote even by the standards of a region that is itself remote. After the raft was driven over the outer reef and settled into the calm water of the lagoon, the crew found themselves on a small uninhabited island. Trees, sand, the sound of surf on the far side of the coral barrier, and not much else. They had survived. That was the dominant fact. They had crossed the Pacific on a wooden raft and survived the landing, and now they sat on a quiet island inside a lagoon and tried to process what had happened to them. They waited there for several days. They had food. The supplies they had rationed carefully across 101 days still had something left in them. And they had fresh coconuts from the island's trees, and they had the raft, which was battered but still present, pulled up against the shore of the islet. Heyerdahl later wrote about those first days on the island with a kind of quiet gratitude. The stillness was strange after months of constant motion. The raft had never stopped moving. It flexed and rolled and shifted every hour of every day. And suddenly the ground was solid and fixed, and that took some adjustment. Several of the crew found it difficult to sleep properly on land for the first few nights, which is one of those small human details that makes the whole thing feel real in a way that statistics and distances do not quite manage. It was Polynesian islanders from the main village of Roroya who eventually found them. The island the crew had landed on was separated from the inhabited part of the atoll, and it took a few days before a group of islanders in canoes came across the lagoon to investigate the strange object they had noticed. The reception was warm. There was a ceremonial quality to the meeting. These men arriving from the sea, from the direction of the rising sun, on a raft that resembled something from a very old story. Heyerdahl was moved by it. He had spent years arguing that the ancestors of these people might have come from the east, from South America, and now he was being welcomed on an eastern shore of Polynesia by people who treated the arrival as something significant. Whether that significance was practical or spiritual, or simply the ordinary hospitality of island people towards strangers, it was genuine. The crew spent time on Roroya before arrangements could be made for their departure. A French schooner eventually arrived to take them and the raft to Tahiti. The raft was towed, not in great shape but intact enough to be moved, and the journey to Papeete took several more days. Tahiti in 1947 was still a relatively quiet place, not yet transformed by the tourism that would come in later decades, and Papeete was a small port town with a colonial French character and a Polynesian heart. The crew arrived to find that people knew who they were. The radio transmissions that Haugeland and Raby had maintained throughout the voyage had kept the world informed of their progress, and by the time Kon-Tiki had been approaching the Tuamotu archipelago, there was genuine international attention on what was happening. Newspapers had been running updates. People in Norway, in the United States, in Britain, had been following along as best they could through the intermittent radio reports and the dispatches that Heyerdahl had arranged to be sent out through amateur radio contacts. In Tahiti, the raft was partially repaired and examined. Local people and French officials came to see it. Journalists arrived, photographs were taken, the crew gave interviews. Heyerdahl, who had a gift for explaining things clearly and who was not shy about his own convictions, talked about the theory, about the voyage, about what he believed it demonstrated. He was 32 years old. He had just crossed the Pacific on a wooden raft. He had the kind of authority that comes not from credentials or institutional position, but from having done something that most people would not dream of attempting. The journey back from Tahiti to the United States and then to Europe was its own kind of process. They were not simply returning home. They were becoming, at each stop, more famous than they had been at the previous one. The story had a quality that cut across languages and cultures and political situations. It was 1947. The Second World War had been over for 2 years. The world was exhausted and divided and anxious about what came next, and into that atmosphere came 6 men on a wooden raft who had sailed across the Pacific because one of them had a theory about ancient migration and wanted to test it. There was something in that story that people needed, something about the possibility of doing an impossible thing for a reason that was not about power or money or survival, but about curiosity, about wanting to know. Knut Haugeland and Torstein Raby, as mentioned, carried their own weight in the story. Haugeland's role in the sabotage of the Vemork heavy water plant in 1943, part of the Norwegian resistance operation that helped prevent Nazi Germany from developing a nuclear weapon, was already the stuff of wartime legend in Norway. He had been part of a small team of men who skied across a frozen Norwegian plateau in winter, descended a nearly vertical gorge, infiltrated a heavily guarded facility, and destroyed the equipment inside without firing a shot and without losing a man. That was the kind of person who had been sitting on the bamboo deck of Kon-Tiki, operating the radio and keeping watch at night. Raby had his own wartime story. He had hidden in occupied Norway, transmitting intelligence to the Allies from inside the country, which was a very dangerous thing to do, and which he had done for a long time. The crew of Kon-Tiki, when you looked at them as individuals, were not ordinary people. They were people who had already demonstrated a particular kind of steadiness under difficult circumstances, and that steadiness had been part of what made the voyage survivable. Eric Hesselberg, the navigator and artist, had been Heyerdahl's childhood friend. He was the one who had drawn the face of the sun god on the sail, and he was the one who had used the sextant and the stars to track their position across 4,300 miles of open ocean. He later wrote his own account of the voyage, a more illustrated, lighter version aimed partly at younger readers, and it captured something of the daily texture of life on the raft that Heyerdahl's own book, which was more focused on the theory and the adventure, did not always reach. The flying fish in the mornings, the sound of the water under the logs at night, the particular quality of the sky in the middle of the Pacific, where there is no light pollution and no land, and the stars are extraordinary. Bengt Danielsson, the Swedish sociologist, was perhaps the most quietly interesting member of the crew. He had not been part of the original plan. He had encountered Heyerdahl in Lima, expressed interest in the voyage, and been invited along, which is a remarkably casual way to join an expedition crossing the Pacific. He had spent the voyage reading, studying Polynesian ethnography, and being, by general agreement, the most composed person on the raft. He went on to become a significant scholar of Polynesian culture and history, eventually settling in Tahiti with his wife, the French anthropologist Marie-Thérèse Danielsson. The voyage was, for him, the beginning of a life's work in the Pacific rather than a single extraordinary episode. Herman Watzinger, the technical engineer, had been the one who nearly drowned, the man who had gone overboard and been pulled back by a rope in one of the most frightening moments of the entire voyage. He had been responsible for the scientific measurements and observations throughout the trip, recording data on weather, ocean temperature, current speed, and marine life. His work gave the expedition a dimension beyond the narrative of adventure. It was also, in a modest way, a scientific survey of a part of the ocean that had not been extensively studied from sea level, from a slow-moving platform over a period of months. When Heyerdahl reached Norway, the reception was something that he probably had not fully anticipated, even accounting for his own considerable confidence in the voyage's significance. He was welcomed as a national hero. Norway in 1947 was a country that had spent 5 years under German occupation and was in the process of rebuilding its sense of itself, and here was a young Norwegian who had done something that the world was talking about. The Kon-Tiki story fit into a Norwegian self-image that valued toughness, endurance, and a certain relationship with the natural world. It resonated alongside the stories of Fridtjof Nansen crossing Greenland on skis in 1888, or Roald Amundsen reaching the South Pole in 1911. Heyerdahl was being placed in that company, and he was not entirely uncomfortable there. The book came out in Norwegian in 1948 and moved quickly. The publisher had not been certain how it would be received. It was a book about a voyage that had been reported in newspapers, and there was a question of whether readers would want to revisit a story they already knew the ending to. The answer was clearly yes, because what Heyerdahl wrote was not simply a retelling of events, but an immersive account of what it felt like to be on that raft. The fear, the wonder, the physical reality of the ocean. The long stretches of ordinary daily life punctuated by sudden danger or sudden beauty. He was a good writer. That helped. The documentary film, assembled from the footage the crew had shot themselves during the voyage, was a different kind of artifact. It was rough in the way that footage shot on a moving raft in the open ocean is inevitably rough. The camera shook. The light was sometimes wrong. The editing was not sophisticated by the standards of professional documentary filmmaking. But it had something that polished films often lack, which is the quality of having actually been there. You could see the whale shark circling the raft. You could see the flying fish. You could see the men's faces in the particular light of the Pacific, squinting into the sun or watching the horizon. When it won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1951, it was not a sentimental choice. It was a recognition that this footage documented something real that had happened, and that the documentation itself was worth honouring. The Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo opened in 1950 on the Big Doi Peninsula, not far from the Norwegian Maritime Museum and the Viking Ship Museum. It was built specifically to house the raft, and the raft has been there ever since. The balsa logs are still there. The hemp rope lashings are still there, worn into the wood in the places where the movement of the sea worked at them for 101 days. The cabin is reconstructed. This sail with the painted sun god face is displayed. It is one of those museum objects that is more affecting in person than in photographs, because photographs do not convey the scale or the material reality of the thing. The fact that it is made of logs and rope, that it's simple and physical and ordinary in its components, and that it crossed the Pacific. Millions of people have visited the museum since it opened. School children, sailors, scientists, tourists who happened to be in Oslo and walked across the peninsula on a grey afternoon. Most of them probably stand in front of the raft for a moment and feel something that is hard to articulate precisely, a mixture of scale and simplicity. The recognition that the distance between what the raft is and what it did is very large, and that the men who sailed it understood that distance and went anyway. The world had celebrated. Norway had celebrated. The book was selling. The film had won its award. The museum was open. And yet the question that had started the whole thing, the question of whether ancient South Americans had sailed west across the Pacific and settled Polynesia, was still very much open. The voyage had proved that the journey was possible. It had not proved that the journey had been made, or by whom, or in which direction. And the scientific community, which had been largely sceptical of Heyerdahl's theory before the voyage, remained largely sceptical after it. The proof of possibility, they argued, was not the same as evidence of history. You could demonstrate that something could be done without demonstrating that it was done. And the evidence they had, the linguistic evidence, the archaeological evidence, the patterns of culture and biology that they had spent decades assembling, pointed, with considerable consistency, in a different direction entirely. That is where the conversation was heading. And it was going to be a long conversation, one that would not be resolved in Heyerdahl's lifetime, and that would eventually produce a resolution stranger and more nuanced than anyone had quite expected. So let us stay with that skepticism for a moment, because it deserves to be understood properly rather than dismissed as academic stubbornness or professional jealousy. The resistance to Heyerdahl's theory was not simply a matter of established experts protecting their territory from an outsider. It was grounded in evidence, real, accumulated, carefully examined evidence that pointed somewhere specific, and that somewhere was not South America. The linguistic case was perhaps the most straightforward. Polynesian languages belong to a family called Austronesian, a vast and well-documented language family that stretches from Madagascar in the west to Hawaii and Easter Island in the east, with its deepest roots in Taiwan and Southeast Asia. Linguists had spent generations mapping the relationships between these languages, tracking how sounds shifted, how words evolved, how grammatical structures branched and changed across thousands of miles and thousands of years. The patterns were consistent and clear: Hawaiian, Tahitian, Maori, Samoan, Tongan. These languages are related to each other and to languages spoken in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in coastal Vietnam, in Taiwan. They are not related to Quechua, the language of the Inca. They are not related to any South American language. Language does not lie in quite the same way that artifacts can be misinterpreted or currents can be misread. If a population migrates and takes its language with them, the language carries the fingerprints of where it came from. Polynesian languages carried Southeast Asian fingerprints, clearly and unmistakably. The archaeological evidence ran in the same direction. The tools, the pottery styles, the agricultural practices, the animal domestication patterns, all of it pointed west to east, not east to west. The pig, the chicken, and the dog, the three animals that Polynesian settlers carried with them across the Pacific, are all animals with Asian origins. The adzes used to carve canoes, the fish hooks, the particular styles of stone architecture found on islands from Tonga to Hawaii. These things had traceable ancestral forms in Southeast Asia. Archaeologists had found sites in Tonga and Samoa that showed the gradual development of what became Polynesian culture over roughly 3,000 years, beginning around 1500 BCE with a people known as the Lapita, who made a distinctive style of dentate-stamped pottery and who had clearly come from somewhere to the west. The Lapita people expanded east, gradually, island by island, generation by generation, and their descendants eventually became the Polynesians. This was not a guess or a rough sketch. It was a detailed, layered, independently verified account of where Polynesian people came from. Heyerdahl knew this evidence existed. He was not ignorant of it. He had a response to it, which was essentially that the evidence showed where the language and the dominant culture came from, but not necessarily where all the people came from. He believed there had been an earlier wave of settlement from South America that was later absorbed or displaced by the Austronesian migration from the west. He was arguing for complexity, for a Polynesia that had been reached from two directions, not one, and the academic community, for the most part, found this unconvincing. The evidence for the Asian origin was too strong, too consistent, too multi-layered. The idea of a South American wave seemed like it was being introduced to save a theory, rather than because the evidence demanded it. What frustrated many anthropologists was not that Heyerdahl had done the voyage. The voyage was remarkable. What frustrated them was the way the voyage was being interpreted in the public conversation. The average reader of the Kon-Tiki book or the viewer of the documentary film came away with the impression that Heyerdahl had proved his theory, that the Raft had crossed the Pacific, and therefore the Polynesians came from South America. The logical gap between those two statements, between showing that something was possible and showing that it happened, was not always obvious to a general audience, and Heyerdahl's enthusiastic advocacy of his own theory did not always help people see that gap clearly. The voyage proved capability. It did not prove history. Heyerdahl was aware of this criticism, and he engaged with it directly, in his books and in his public lectures and in the academic papers he wrote, which were more careful in their claims than his popular writing sometimes was. He was not trying to deceive anyone. He genuinely believed that the evidence, taken as a whole, supported the idea of South American contact with Polynesia, and he spent decades gathering more of it: botanical studies, analysis of cultural practices, archaeological work on Easter Island and elsewhere. He was a tireless researcher, not a man who had made a dramatic gesture and then retired to live off the fame. He kept working. He kept arguing, and the academic community kept largely disagreeing with him. There was something genuinely interesting in this standoff, though, because both sides were partly right, and neither side fully knew it yet. The mainstream anthropologists were right that the primary migration route into Polynesia came from Southeast Asia, and that the linguistic and archaeological evidence for this was overwhelming. But Heyerdahl was right that the ocean between South America and Polynesia was not an uncrossable barrier, and that contact of some kind had occurred. He was wrong about the direction of primary settlement. He was not wrong that contact happened. The evidence for that contact had been sitting in plain sight for a long time, in the form of the sweet potato. This is worth dwelling on, because it is one of those botanical facts that seems almost too convenient to be true, and yet it is thoroughly documented. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, is a plant native to South America. Its wild ancestors are found in the Andes and in coastal Peru. It was domesticated in South America thousands of years ago, and it was present across Polynesia, in the Cook Islands, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, in Easter Island, well before any European contact. The first European explorers to reach Polynesia in the 16th and 17th centuries found sweet potatoes growing there. They had not brought them. The plants were already established, already integrated into Polynesian agriculture, already known by names that were linguistically related to South American words for the same plant. In Quechua, the sweet potato is called kumar. In Polynesian languages, it is called kumara or kumala, or variations on that sound. That is not a coincidence. That is a word that travelled with a plant across the Pacific. The sweet potato could not have floated across the ocean on its own and remained viable. It had to be carried. someone brought it. The question was who, and when, and in which direction. Heyerdahl argued that South Americans had carried it west. His critics suggested that Polynesians had sailed east to South America and brought it back, which would be consistent with the Polynesian origin story and would not require any South American presence in Polynesia. The plant proved contact. It did not, by itself, prove the direction. Then, in 2020, a study was published in the journal Nature that changed the texture of this debate in a significant way. A team of researchers led by Alexander Ioannidis at Stanford University analysed the genomes of ancient and modern Polynesian populations alongside Native American populations from South America. They were looking for genetic signatures, specific segments of DNA that could be traced to particular ancestral populations. What they found was unambiguous. There was clear evidence of admixture between Polynesian people and Native American people, and the timing of that admixture pointed to contact occurring around 1150 CE, give or take a century or so. The signal was strongest in populations from the Marquesas Islands, the same islands where Heyerdahl had lived in 1937 and 1938, where he had first begun to develop his theory. The Native American population most closely linked to this genetic signal was from Colombia, on the northwestern coast of South America. This was not a small or ambiguous finding. It was a clear, statistically robust genetic signature of real contact between real people. Ancient Polynesians and ancient South Americans had met, had children together, and those children had descendants who were still alive, and whose DNA carried the record of that meeting. The contact had happened somewhere, at some point around the mid-12th century, and it had left a permanent biological trace. What the study did not prove, and what its authors were careful to note, was the direction of travel. The genetic contact could have occurred because Polynesians sailed east to South America, which is entirely consistent with what we know about Polynesian seamanship. Polynesians were extraordinary navigators who sailed enormous double-hulled canoes across vast stretches of open ocean using stars, currents, wave patterns, and bird behaviour. They reached Hawaii from the Marquesas, a distance of roughly 2,000 miles. They reached New Zealand from central Polynesia, a distance of roughly 2,500 miles. Reaching the coast of South America was within their demonstrated capability. The genetic contact could have happened on South American shores, with Polynesians who then sailed back west carrying sweet potatoes and, unknowingly, the genetic legacy of a South American partner or community. Alternatively, the contact could have happened in Polynesia if South Americans had made the westward crossing. The genetic evidence does not distinguish between these two scenarios. What it does is confirm that the contact was real, that it was not just a matter of a plant drifting across the ocean, that actual human beings from South America and Polynesia had been in the same place at the same time. For Heyerdahl's theory, this was both a vindication and a complication. It was a vindication in the sense that he had always insisted the ocean was not a barrier and that contact had occurred, and the genetic evidence supported that insistence. It was a complication in the sense that the evidence still did not support his specific claim that South Americans had been the primary settlers of Polynesia, arriving before the Austronesian migration from the west. The genetic signal from the 2020 study was a trace, a relatively small component of Polynesian ancestry, not the dominant founding population that Heyerdahl had imagined. The mainstream account of Polynesian origins, rooted in Southeast Asia, remained intact. The contact with South America was real, but it was a chapter in the story, not the origin of it. Heyerdahl had died in 2002, 18 years before the study was published. He never got to read it. It is interesting to imagine what he would have made of it, whether he would have seen it as confirmation of his core intuition, or whether he would have pushed back on the interpretation, insisting that the genetic signal was evidence of exactly the kind of early South American presence he had always argued for. Knowing what we know of the man, he probably would have done both, with considerable energy. He was not someone who conceded ground easily, but he was also not someone who ignored evidence. He would have engaged with it seriously, argued with it vigorously, and probably written a book about it. What the genetic study ultimately revealed was that the truth of the Pacific's human history was more layered and more interesting than either side of the Heyerdahl debate had fully allowed. The mainstream anthropologists had been right about the primary migration route and the linguistic and archaeological evidence supporting it. Heyerdahl had been right that contact with South America was real and that the ocean was crossable. Both things were true simultaneously, and they pointed toward a picture of ancient Pacific navigation that was, if anything, more impressive than either account on its own. People were moving across this ocean in both directions using different technologies at different times for reasons we can only partly reconstruct, in an era that most people in the modern world would associate with small boats staying close to shore. The debate had never really been about whether Heyerdahl was brave or whether the voyage was impressive. Everyone agreed on those points. The debate was about what the voyage meant, what it proved, and what the full story of Polynesian origins actually looked like. And the answer, it turned out, was that it looked like a story that neither a wooden raft nor a single expedition could fully contain. The evidence kept accumulating, and the picture kept getting more complex, and that complexity was, in its own quiet way, a tribute to the question that Heyerdahl had spent his life asking, even if the answer was not quite the one he had expected. And that brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment. Not the debate itself, but the man at the centre of it. Because Heyerdahl's life did not end with Kon-Tiki, and his curiosity did not narrow after the fame arrived. If anything, the success of the raft voyage seems to have expanded his ambitions rather than satisfied them. He had more oceans to cross, more questions to test, more boats to build. So let's talk about the sweet potato. It seems like a small thing to build an argument around. A root vegetable, starchy and orange, the kind of thing you might roast in the oven on a cold evening without thinking much about where it came from. But in the context of Pacific prehistory, the sweet potato is one of the most quietly extraordinary pieces of evidence that researchers have ever had to explain. And for decades it sat in the middle of the Heyerdahl debate like a question that neither side could fully answer. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, is native to South America. That part is well established. Its wild ancestors grow in the Americas, its domestication happened in the Americas, and its genetic roots are unambiguously American. And yet, when European explorers arrived in Polynesia in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, they found sweet potatoes already growing there. Not introduced by Europeans, not a recent arrival, already cultivated, already woven into local food systems, already known by names that linguists found interesting. In the Cook Islands, the sweet potato was called kumara. In Hawaii, it was called wala. In New Zealand, it was kumara again. In Easter Island, it was kumara as well. And in parts of South America, particularly among the Quechua-speaking peoples of the Andes, the word for sweet potato was kumar or kumar. The similarity across those languages, Polynesian on one side, Quechua on the other, was not easy to dismiss as coincidence. It suggested the plant and its name had travelled together, which meant people had carried it, which meant people from one side of the Pacific had at some point been in contact with people on the other side. This was the botanical evidence Heyerdahl had pointed to since the 1940s, and it was genuinely compelling. The sweet potato cannot float across the Pacific on its own and remain viable. Unlike coconuts, which can drift and germinate after long ocean journeys, sweet potato tubers do not survive extended saltwater immersion. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to bring it deliberately, or at least unknowingly, in a vessel, from one side of the ocean to the other. The question was always who and in which direction. For a long time, the sweet potato question was discussed but not resolved. Botanists and archaeologists acknowledged it as a real puzzle. Some suggested the plant might have arrived through multiple contact events. Others proposed that Polynesians had sailed east to South America, collected the plant, and brought it back, which would have required no westward South American voyage at all, and would have been entirely consistent with what Polynesian navigators were capable of. The debate circled around the evidence without quite landing on a definitive answer. And then, in 2020, something shifted. A large international research team published a study in the journal Nature that approached the contact question not through plants or artifacts or linguistic patterns, but through ancient DNA. They analysed genetic material from individuals across Polynesia, including samples from archaeological sites in the Marquesas, the Cook Islands, the Tuamotu Archipelago and Easter Island, and compared those samples with genetic data from indigenous populations across South America. What they found was a clear and statistically robust signal of genetic admixture. Polynesian and Native American populations had interbred. The genetic evidence placed the contact event at around 1150 CE, give or take a few decades, which was well before any European presence in the Pacific. And the Polynesian population most strongly associated with the signal was the Marquesas Islands, the very islands where Heyerdahl had lived in 1937 and 1938, and where he had first begun to develop his theory. The Native American population most closely linked to the genetic signal came from the northwestern coast of South America, broadly consistent with populations from what is now Colombia. This was not a faint or ambiguous trace. The researchers described it as a clear admixture event, a real mixing of populations, not a statistical artifact. Ancient people from South America and ancient Polynesians had been in the same place at the same time, had formed relationships, and had left descendants. Those descendants were still alive, and their DNA carried the record of that meeting across nearly 1,000 years. What the study could not determine, and what the authors were careful to acknowledge, was the direction of travel. The genetic contact was real, but genetics alone cannot tell you who sailed to whom. The meeting could have happened because Polynesians sailed east to the coast of South America, which fits comfortably with everything we know about Polynesian navigation. These were people who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes, reading stars and currents and wave patterns with a precision that still impresses modern sailors. Reaching South America from the Marquesas would have been a long voyage, but it was within the range of what Polynesian navigators had demonstrably done in other directions. They could have arrived on South American shores, interacted with coastal communities, and returned west with sweet potatoes, and without knowing it, with the genetic legacy of those interactions. Alternatively, the contact could have happened the other way. South Americans could have made the westward crossing, the crossing that Heyerdahl had always argued was possible, and arrived in Polynesia, where they settled or intermingled with the existing population before the genetic trace was absorbed into the broader Polynesian gene pool. The 2020 study did not rule this out. It simply could not confirm it from the data available. What it did confirm was that the contact was human, direct, and real. The sweet potato had not drifted. People had moved, and that movement had left a mark in the biology of living human beings that was still readable 1,000 years later. For anyone who had followed the Heyerdahl debate, that was a remarkable thing to absorb. The man had spent decades insisting that the ocean between South America and Polynesia was not a barrier. That contact had occurred, that the evidence for it was real and worth taking seriously. And here, 18 years after his death, a genetic study was confirming that he had been right about the contact, even if the specifics of his theory remained contested, because the complication was still there, and it was worth being clear about. The genetic signal from the 2020 study represented a relatively small component of Polynesian ancestry. It was a real and significant admixture event, but it was not the founding signature of Polynesian populations. The dominant ancestry of Polynesian peoples remained consistent with the Austronesian migration from Southeast Asia and Taiwan, the same migration route that linguists and archaeologists had been pointing to for decades. The mainstream account of Polynesian origins was not overturned by the study. It was complicated by it, enriched by it, made more interesting by it. But the core framework, Polynesians descending primarily from Asian populations who migrated eastward across the Pacific, remained the best supported explanation for the majority of the evidence. So what the genetic study actually revealed was something more nuanced than either Heyerdahl or his critics had fully articulated. It revealed that the Pacific's human history was not a single story, with a single direction of travel. It was a layered history, with multiple movements, multiple contacts, multiple moments of connection between populations separated by enormous stretches of open water. The primary migration had come from the west, from Asia, carried by Austronesian-speaking peoples in remarkable ocean voyages that spanned thousands of years and thousands of miles. But somewhere along the way, probably around the 12th century, there had also been contact with South America. A real contact, a human contact, close enough and sustained enough to leave genetic traces. And the sweet potato had come along for the journey, in whichever direction the journey had gone. This is where the story becomes genuinely interesting to sit with, because it does not resolve neatly into a victory for either side. Heyerdahl was right that the ocean was crossable, and that contact had occurred. His critics were right that Polynesia was not primarily settled by South Americans, and that the linguistic and archaeological evidence for Asian origins was solid. Both things are true. They were always both true, but for a long time the debate was framed as if only one of them could be, and that framing did not serve the actual complexity of the history. There is something almost poignant about the fact that the genetic confirmation came so long after Heyerdahl's death. He had argued for contact his entire adult life, and the clearest scientific evidence for it arrived in 2020, when he had been gone for 18 years. He never read the study. He never got to sit with the data and work out what it meant for his theory, or argue with the interpretation, or write another book about it. And knowing what we know of him, he almost certainly would have done all of those things. He was not the kind of person who received information quietly and moved on. He engaged with everything, pushed back on everything, and never stopped trying to refine his argument. The study would have given him real ammunition, and it also would have given him real problems, and he would have found that combination irresistible. What the genetic evidence ultimately suggests is that the Pacific was a more connected place in the pre-Columbian era than the modern imagination tends to picture. We often think of ancient peoples as confined to their immediate geography, bounded by the horizon, unable to cross the distances that separated them from the rest of the world. But the evidence from Polynesia, the navigation, the settlement of remote islands, the contact with South America, the distribution of the sweet potato across thousands of miles of ocean, tells a different story. People were moving. They were covering distances that seem improbable even with modern vessels. They were doing it deliberately, with skill and knowledge and preparation, and they were making contact with other peoples across those distances in ways that left permanent marks on language, biology, and agriculture. Heyerdahl had felt that truth in his bones since his time on Fatuhiva in 1937, when he watched the wind come from the east and listened to stories about tiki and looked at the sweet potato growing in the garden and thought, someone brought this here, someone crossed that water. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove it, and the methods he used, building a raft, sailing it across the Pacific, writing books, making films, arguing loudly and persistently in academic forums, were unconventional and sometimes frustrating to the scholars who preferred quieter forms of evidence. But the core intuition was sound. The contact was real. The ocean was not a wall. The debate around his theory is still alive in academic circles, in a quieter form now, shaped by the genetic data and by ongoing archaeological work in the Pacific. Researchers continue to refine the picture, adding detail to the timing and direction of the contact, working out the genetic contributions of different populations, tracing the spread of the sweet potato through Polynesia, and trying to connect it to specific migration events. The story is still being written. What Heyerdahl contributed to it was not a final answer but a persistent question, asked with enough force and physical commitment that the field could not ignore it. And in the end, the question turned out to be more right than wrong, even if the answer was more complicated than he had imagined. It is worth pausing here for a moment and just sitting with the image of the sweet potato, this ordinary humble vegetable, as a kind of messenger across 1,000 years of history. Somebody carried it. Somebody crossed one of the largest bodies of water on Earth and brought it with them, probably not even thinking of it as historically significant, just as food, just as something useful to have on a long voyage. And it grew, and it spread, and it was still growing when the European ships arrived. And it was still there when the geneticists came along with their sequencing technology. And it is still there now, still being eaten, still called kumara in parts of the Pacific, still carrying in its name the faint echo of a crossing that happened nearly 9 centuries ago. That is a long chain of evidence to follow, and it leads somewhere real. And it leads, in its own indirect way, back to the man who first made that connection in a garden on Fatuhiva and refused to let go of it for the rest of his life. Heyerdahl was not always right, and he was not always easy, and his insistence could shade into stubbornness in ways that did not always serve him well in academic debates. But he was asking a real question, and he was willing to stake his life on it quite literally, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on a raft made of balsa wood and hemp rope. That willingness, that particular combination of curiosity and physical commitment, is something worth thinking about, and it brings us naturally to the question of what else he did with it. Because Kon-Tiki was not the end of his story. It was in many ways just the beginning of a much longer one. After Kon-Tiki, a lesser person might have settled into the reputation. The book was selling in dozens of languages. The film had won an Academy Award, the raft was in a museum in Oslo, and Thor Heyerdahl's name was known in households that had never heard of the Tuamotu archipelago and never would. He was famous in the uncomplicated way that explorers sometimes become famous, celebrated for a single dramatic act, associated with a single image, the bearded man on the wooden raft, the sail with the painted face. He could have lectured, accepted honorary degrees, given interviews, and let the rest of his life be a comfortable extension of that one extraordinary summer. He did not do that. He was constitutionally incapable of doing that. The question that drove him after Kon-Tiki was essentially the same question in a different ocean. If ancient peoples could cross the Pacific, what other crossings had been made? What other distances had been covered by boats that history had decided were too primitive to matter? He turned his attention to the Atlantic, and specifically to a possibility that mainstream archaeology found even more uncomfortable than his South American migration theory. The idea that ancient Egyptians, or people from the ancient Mediterranean world, might have made contact with the Americas long before Columbus. The evidence he found most compelling was visual and architectural. Reed boats appear in the iconography of ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and pre-Columbian South America. Pyramid building traditions appear on both sides of the Atlantic. He was careful, or tried to be careful, not to claim direct connection without demonstration, and by now he had learned from Kon-Tiki that the most powerful form of demonstration was physical. So he decided to build a reed boat and cross the Atlantic in it. He called the project Ra, after the Egyptian sun god. The boat was constructed in 1969 by builders from Chad, people from the Buduma people around Lake Chad, who still built and used reed boats in a tradition that had survived for centuries. The design was based on ancient Egyptian paintings and carvings, scaled up and adapted for open ocean use. The boat was roughly 50 feet long, built from bundles of papyrus reed lashed tightly together, with a single square sail and a curved prow that lifted upward at the bow in the style shown in Egyptian tomb paintings. Ra departed from Safi on the Atlantic coast of Morocco in May 1969 with a crew of 7 men from 7 different countries, a detail Heyerdahl was deliberate about because he wanted the voyage to carry a message about human cooperation as well as human capability. The crew included a Norwegian, an American, an Egyptian, a Mexican, a Chad national, an Italian, and a Russian. The Cold War was still very much alive in 1969. Getting a Norwegian and a Russian to share a reed boat in the Atlantic was not a small thing, and Heyerdahl knew it, and he meant it. Rah, I did not make it. After about 8 weeks at sea, covering roughly 3,000 miles, the boat began to break apart. The stern section sagged and the lashing started to fail, and after consultation the crew abandoned ship approximately 600 miles short of Barbados. Heyerdahl was disappointed but not defeated. He had learned something specific and technical from the failure. The Budimir builders had omitted a rope that appeared in ancient Egyptian depictions of reed boats, a rope that ran from the curved stern back to the main body of the vessel, preventing exactly the kind of sagging that had doomed Ra the First. It was a small thing, and it had made the difference between success and failure. Ra the Second was built the following year, in 1970, by Aymara reed boat builders from Bolivia, people from Lake Titicaca, where the tradition of building Totora reed boats had also survived into the modern era. The stern rope was included this time. The crew was largely the same. They departed from Safi again in May 1970, and 57 days later, on July 12, 1970, Ra II arrived at Bridgetown, Barbados. The Atlantic had been crossed on a papyrus reed boat. The journey was approximately 4,000 miles. The boat was still seaworthy on arrival, which Heyerdahl considered important. It meant the crossing was not a desperate survival story, but a demonstration of genuine capability. What Ra II proved, in the same spirit as Kon-Tiki, was not that ancient Egyptians had sailed to the Americas, but that the voyage was physically possible. The Atlantic, like the Pacific, was not the absolute barrier that modern assumptions tended to make it. Whether anyone actually made the crossing in antiquity remained, and still remains, a separate and more complicated question. But the demonstration was real, and it was made with period-appropriate materials by a crew that included people whose ancestors had actually built boats like this. He did not stop there. In 1977, Heyerdahl organised the Tigris Expedition, which was in some ways his most ambitious and most philosophically charged project. The Tigris was a reed boat built in Iraq, near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, from birdie reed, the same material that had been used in ancient Mesopotamia. The goal was to demonstrate maritime connections between three of the world's earliest civilizations: Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan, and the ancient cultures of East Africa, particularly around the Gulf of Aden and the Horn of Africa. The Tigris launched in November 1977, sailed down through the Persian Gulf, crossed the Gulf of Oman, reached Pakistan, and then turned westward toward the Red Sea. By the standards of the Ra voyages, it was a longer and more complex journey, navigating through some of the most geopolitically complicated waters in the world. The crew spent about 5 months at sea, covering roughly 4,000 miles, and the boat remained functional throughout. But the Tigris expedition did not end with a landing celebration. In April 1978, with the boat still seaworthy, Heyerdahl made the decision to burn it. They were in the Gulf of Aden, and the region around them was at war, fighting in Djibouti, conflict along the Somali coast, the ongoing turbulence of the Horn of Africa. Heyerdahl felt that they could not land anywhere without being drawn into a political situation that contradicted everything the expedition was meant to represent. So the crew gathered on deck, and they burned the Tigris, and Heyerdahl sent a letter to the Secretary-General of the United Nations explaining what he had done and why. The letter was a protest against the wars being fought in the region by nations supplying weapons to all sides. It was an unusual act, burning your own ship as a political statement, and it was very much in keeping with the man who made it. Beyond the ocean voyages, Heyerdahl spent significant portions of his later life doing archaeological fieldwork. He conducted excavations on Easter Island in the 1980s and 1990s, working on the question of the island's settlement and the construction of the Moai, the enormous stone figures that stand along the coastline. His interpretation of the Easter Island evidence was, characteristically, not the mainstream one, and it generated the same mix of genuine engagement and academic frustration that his other theories had always produced. He also worked in the Maldives, those low coral islands in the Indian Ocean, where he found evidence of pre-Islamic stone structures that he believed pointed to ancient maritime contact between the Maldives and civilizations further north and west. He published his findings, argued his case, and continued working. He was still working in April 2002. He had gone to Colomiceri, a small village on the Italian Riviera, to visit friends. He had a house there, a place he had kept for years, and he had been spending time there while dealing with a brain tumour that had been diagnosed not long before. He died on April 18th, 2002. He was 87 years old. He had been writing almost until the end. What is striking, looking back at the full arc of his life, is the consistency of the method. He had one basic approach to a question he found compelling. Build the thing, sail the thing, go there, do it, and then write about what happened. The voyages were arguments. The physical journeys were his version of evidence. He was not a conventionally trained archaeologist or linguist, and the specialists in those fields sometimes found him maddening precisely because he operated outside their frameworks and did not always engage with their evidence on their terms. But he was doing something that most academics genuinely cannot do, which is put his body into the argument. He was not theorizing about whether a balsa raft could cross the Pacific. He was on the balsa raft. There is a quality to that kind of commitment that is hard to dismiss, even when the specific conclusions are wrong or incomplete. When you disagree with a paper, you write a response. When you disagree with a man who has just spent 101 days on a wooden raft in the open ocean, the conversation is a little different. Heyerdahl understood that, and he used it, and it was not dishonest. He genuinely believed what he was doing, and he was genuinely willing to risk his life for it. That combination of physical courage and intellectual stubbornness is rare, and it left a mark on the world that purely academic work rarely does. His book sold in the tens of millions. The Kon-Tiki book alone has been translated into more than 70 languages and is still in print. The Raft expeditions produced their own book, and the Tigris expedition produced another, and each one found readers who had never thought much about ancient maritime history and came away thinking about it quite a lot. He brought these questions to people who would never read an academic journal, and he brought them in the most direct possible way, by telling the story of what it actually felt like to be out there, on the water, in a boat made of reeds or logs, watching the horizon and wondering whether you were going to make it. That is a form of communication that has its own value, separate from the question of whether the specific theories hold up under scrutiny. He made the ancient ocean feel real and navigable and human. He made the distances feel crossable, and in doing so, he changed the way a generation of readers thought about what ancient people were capable of, which is not a small thing, even if the details of his arguments needed correction. The Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo holds the original raft, still largely intact despite everything it went through. It also holds Ra II, the papyrus boat that completed the Atlantic crossing. The two boats sit in the same building, these extraordinary objects that were once out in the middle of oceans, surrounded by nothing, carrying a small group of people and a very large idea. Visitors walk around them and look at the hemp rope and the balsa logs and the papyrus bundles, and some of them probably find it hard to believe that anyone actually sailed these things across open water. That disbelief is itself a kind of tribute to what was done. Heyerdahl's legacy is genuinely complicated, in the way that the legacies of people who operate at the edge of their fields often are. He was right about some things and wrong about others, and the proportion of right to wrong has shifted over time as new evidence has come in. The genetic data from 2020 moved the needle in his direction on the question of Pacific contact. The linguistic and archaeological evidence for Asian origins of Polynesian peoples remains solid and has not shifted. He sits somewhere in the middle of the story now, not vindicated in full, not dismissed in full, but recognised as someone who asked a real question loudly enough that the field eventually had to answer it properly. What he leaves behind is not just a theory about migration routes, it is something harder to categorise. A demonstration of what happens when someone takes an idea seriously enough to test it with their own life. That is a rare thing in any era, and it is worth remembering on its own terms, separate from the academic arguments that have swirled around it for decades. He crossed the Pacific on a wooden raft because he believed something, and he needed to know if the ocean would let him. And the ocean did. And that, in ways that go beyond any particular debate about ancient history, is a story worth telling. And it brings us finally to the question of what all of this means, not just for the history of Polynesia or the academic debate about migration, but for something larger and quieter, something about the nature of curiosity itself and what human beings have always been willing to do in the service of a question they cannot let go of. There is something about the number 101 that stays with you once you know what it represents. Not a round number, not a clean century, just 101 days, the amount of time it takes a wooden raft to cross the Pacific Ocean, when the wind and current are willing and the ropes hold and the men on board do not give up. It is a strangely specific number for something so enormous, and maybe that specificity is part of what makes it feel real. Not a legend, not an approximation. 101 days, 4,300 miles, 9 balsa logs. 6 men, 1 idea. What Kon-Tiki represents, at this distance of more than 70 years, is something that sits a little outside the usual categories we use to judge expeditions or scientific arguments. It was not purely a scientific experiment because the controls were imperfect and the conclusion was contested. It was not purely an adventure because Heyerdahl genuinely believed he was demonstrating something true about human history. It was not propaganda because he was not trying to deceive anyone. He was trying to convince people, which is a different thing. It existed in a space that is hard to name cleanly, somewhere between proof and gesture, between argument and act of faith, and maybe that is exactly the right place for it to exist. The voyage proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Pacific was crossable on a balsa raft using materials and methods available to ancient South American peoples. That is not a small thing. Before Kon-Tiki, the dominant assumption in much of the academic world was that the Pacific was effectively a barrier from the South American side, that the distances were too great, the technology too primitive, the ocean too hostile. Heyerdahl did not argue against this in a journal article. He got on a raft and crossed it. And when he arrived on the other side, wet and exhausted and alive, the argument about physical possibility was effectively over. The ocean was not a wall. It was a road. It had always been a road. The question was only ever who had travelled it, in which direction, and when. On that deeper question, the story turned out to be more complicated than Heyerdahl hoped, and more interesting than his critics expected. The genetic evidence that emerged in 2020 confirmed what the sweet potato had been quietly suggesting for centuries, that there was real contact between South America and Polynesia before Europeans arrived, that people and plants moved across that water in ways that the tidy migration maps had not fully accounted for. Heyerdahl's specific theory about the direction and scale of migration was not confirmed, but the basic intuition that drove him, that the ocean was a place of movement and connection rather than isolation, turned out to be more right than wrong. The ancient Pacific was busy. People were moving across it in multiple directions over long periods of time, and the full picture is still being assembled piece by piece, from DNA samples and botanical records and oral traditions and reef archaeology. He helped make that picture possible by refusing to let the question rest. There is something worth sitting with in that, because it is not the usual shape of a scientific vindication. He did not turn out to be right in the way he expected. He turned out to be right in a different way, and a more interesting one. Right that the question was real. Right that the ocean was not the obstacle people assumed. Right that ancient peoples were capable of things the modern world had underestimated. The specific mechanism he proposed was incomplete. The underlying instinct was sound. That is a stranger kind of legacy than simple vindication or simple dismissal, and it suits him somehow. He was always a stranger kind of figure than the categories available to him could quite contain. Think about what it actually took to do what he did. He was not a sailor. He had no maritime training. He had spent time in the Marquesas and noticed things that other people had not noticed, or had noticed and set aside, and he became convinced of something that the experts around him considered implausible. And rather than spend another decade writing papers that no one would accept, he went to Peru, found some balsa trees, built a raft and sailed it across the largest ocean on the planet. There is a directness to that response that is almost disarming. It is the kind of thing that sounds straightforward when you describe it briefly and becomes more extraordinary the longer you think about it. He was 32 years old when Kon-Tiki left Callao. 32. With no sailing experience, a crew of 5 other men who were also largely inexperienced at sea, a raft that naval engineers had told him would sink, and a destination that was thousands of miles away across open water. The fear he described feeling on that first night, the raft groaning beneath him, the darkness absolute, the shore already gone, was completely reasonable. What is less reasonable, in the best possible way, is that he stayed on the raft anyway, that all of them stayed, that they kept their watches and caught their flying fish and tracked their position with a sextant and kept going, day after day through storms and sharks and the slow, psychological weight of being very small in a very large ocean. That kind of commitment to an idea is genuinely rare. Most of us, even when we believe something strongly, believe it from a comfortable distance. We argue for it, we defend it, we write it down. We do not build a raft and sail it across the Pacific to demonstrate it. Heyerdahl collapsed the distance between conviction and action in a way that is almost uncomfortable to look at directly, because it implicitly asks a question about what the rest of us do with the things we believe. He had a theory about ancient ocean voyaging, and he went and did an ancient ocean voyage. The elegance of that response is hard to argue with, even when the theory itself is imperfect. And there is something in the voyage itself, separate from all the arguments about migration routes and genetic data and linguistic families, that feels worth preserving as its own kind of story. The image of 6 men on a wooden raft in the middle of the Pacific, watching whale sharks circle beneath them in water so clear they could see the animal's full length, watching luminescent plankton light up the wake at night, eating flying fish for breakfast because the fish had simply landed on the deck while they slept. The parrot named Larita who rode with them for weeks before a wave took her. Hermann Watzinger going overboard and being pulled back by a rope, and the whole crew understanding in that moment exactly how far from help they were. Erich Hesselberg drawing and painting while also navigating, keeping a visual record of the ocean as it moved past them. Bengt Danielsson reading books in Spanish and serving as the onboard sociologist, quietly observing the group dynamics of men living in very close quarters for a very long time. These details matter. They make the voyage human-sized in a way that the statistics alone do not. 4,300 miles is an abstraction. Flying fish for breakfast is not. The raft itself sits in Oslo now, in the museum that was built to hold it. You can walk up close to it and look at the hemp rope and the balsa logs and the small bamboo cabin and the painted face of Kon-Tiki on the sail, and it is genuinely hard to believe that this object crossed the Pacific Ocean. It looks too simple, too fragile, too small. And that is exactly the point in a way, because the Inca rafts that inspired it were also simple, also made of materials that seemed inadequate to the distances they covered, and they also crossed the ocean. The simplicity is not a limitation, it is the argument. The raft works because the ocean lets it work, because the current and the wind are real and consistent and powerful, and because human beings who understand those forces and commit to them can go very, very far. Heyerdahl understood something that is easy to forget in an era of satellite navigation and weather forecasting and engine power, which is that the ocean has its own logic and its own roots, and those routes were available to ancient peoples just as they are available now. The Humboldt Current does not care what century it is. The trade winds do not check credentials. If you build a raft that floats and you put it in the current at the right time of year, it will carry you west. It was carrying things west long before anyone built a raft. The ocean is not neutral. It has preferences, patterns, directions. The ancient peoples who lived along its edges learned those patterns over generations, and they used them, and the fact that we lost track of that knowledge for a while does not mean the knowledge was not there. That is perhaps the quietest and most lasting thing the Kon-Tiki Expedition gave us, a restored sense of what ancient human beings were capable of. Not superhuman capability, not magic, not technology we cannot understand, just careful observation, accumulated knowledge, and the willingness to commit to a long and uncertain journey. The same things that have always moved people across difficult terrain, the same things that are still moving people across difficult terrain today, in different forms, in different places. If you're listening to this tonight, wherever you are, whatever the hour is, I hope there is something in this story that feels quietly useful, not in a practical sense. Most of us are not planning to build a balsa raft anytime soon, and that is probably fine. But in the sense that it is good to be reminded that the distance between an idea and an act can be shorter than it looks, that the things we believe are worth testing, that the ocean, whatever ocean you happen to be facing, literal or otherwise, is not necessarily the barrier it appears to be from the shore. Thor Heyerdahl spent his whole life testing that proposition in the most literal way available to him, and the ocean kept letting him through. That is not a guarantee that it works for every question or every voyage, but it is evidence of something. It is evidence that the attempt is worth making, that the commitment is worth having, that the question is worth asking loudly enough that the world has to take it seriously. The Kon-Tiki crossed the Pacific in 1947 and landed on a reef in the Tuamotu archipelago, and 6 men climbed off a broken raft onto a coral island, and were found a few days later by Polynesian islanders who came across the lagoon in canoes. It is a good ending to a voyage. It is a very human ending, messy and imperfect and alive. Not a smooth arrival at a planned destination, but a crash landing on a reef and a walk across coral and a wait in the shade until someone came. That is how a lot of the best journeys end. Not the way you planned, but somewhere real. If you have been listening along tonight, thank you for spending this time here. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about distance or belief, or what it means to put your body into an argument, I would love to know. Leave a comment, share the video with someone who might appreciate it, and if you have not yet subscribed to Life Beyond Seen, this is a gentle invitation to do that. There is more waiting here, and we take our time with all of it. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are, and if you happen to be near the ocean, listen to it for a moment. It has been moving in the same direction for a very long time.